Chapter 320. It was curfew time. Dean moved along the street at full speed. He avoided the patrolling soldiers in advance by relying on his keen hearing. It didn't take long for him to reach a small town on the outskirts. It was a rundown town. The soldiers on duty had a meager salary. They were chatting and dozing at the entrance of the town. After the curfew, they were too lazy to care about anything else. Dean came to the butcher's house, put on a mask, and still bought an iron-back pig. The head of the butcher's house was a middle-aged man who had already recognized Dean. He was not surprised to see Dean dressed like this. He suspected that Dean was a thief, so he politely handed the iron-back pig that had been slaughtered in advance to Dean. His youngest son did not sleep. When he came out and saw Dean, he screamed in fear and was scolded by the butcher. His wife immediately took the child to the room and closed the door. Only whispers came out. Ordinary people could not hear them, but they could not escape Dean's ears. Dean listened to his wife's words while trading. Seeing that no one was talking about him behind his back, he was relieved. He put the iron-back pig into a sack with thick thread and turned to leave. The middle-aged butcher was deeply awed by the power shown by this action. He remembered Dean's warning more and more. He didn't dare to expose the trade between the two. After all, if this matter was spread out, he would also be punished by the law. Dean followed the river outside the town and left the town from the side. He didn't see any patrolling soldiers along the way. After entering the wilderness, he quickly went to the fortress where he had repeatedly sneaked into. Today was different from usual. Looking from afar, there was obviously a team of soldiers on the fortress. The smell of different people was much stronger. Dean observed for a moment, found a gap, and climbed over the wall with ease. After sneaking out of the fortress, duty immediately went along the wilderness to the dilapidated building. Dudian saw Splitter in the tungsten steel cage as he came to the basement of the building. The latter also saw him and stood up from its sleeping position. Its scythe-like arms touched the tungsten steel cage. Ding, ding, ding. It sounded like countless swords were hitting against each other. Dean took out a dagger and, as usual, cut the iron-back pig into several pieces and threw them to it. The little Splitter looked at the iron-back pig that was thrown into its stomach and happily enjoyed it. It didn't take long for the whole iron-back pig to enter its stomach. After eating, it sat down and rested again. It seemed as if it knew that there wouldn't be any more food. Dean was happy to see that it didn't roar at him. He didn't carry Splitter's bloodshell, so he didn't have the smell of Splitter. But the little Splitter seemed to know him. Even if he was close to the cage, it didn't arouse its fierceness. The military should be carrying out the final defense on the wall of the residential area. Once the wall is breached, the barbarians will be like wolves in a flock of sheep. The casualties will be uncountable. Dean's eyes lit up. Although the military should be able to hold on, but the barbarians couldn't be underestimated. In any case, the first people to be sacrificed were the nomadic civilians who lived on the plain. Although there were only some scattered villages and small towns, but the population was at least tens of thousands. If the military didn't counterattack, then it meant that the residents of the plain would be abandoned by the military. Dean's eyes narrowed as an idea came to his mind. He turned around and quietly left. It was early in the morning when Dean returned to the hotel. He woke up the coachman and went directly to the temple. Dean went straight to the temple and bought 100 kilograms of materials. He found another thing. How much do you need to exchange for gold coins? The person behind the counter was still the same youth. Dean was wearing a mask, but he recognized him. It will only cost 10 gold coins for one drop. Dean immediately said, "Give me 2 bottles." The youth was slightly stunned before he bitterly smiled. "With your authority, you can only purchase 1,000 drops at a time. That's the amount of 1 bottle." Dean frowned. "All right, I'll give you 1 bottle." The youth's mouth twitched. He knew that Dean had recently developed a new invention, so he didn't lack money. "All right, fill out the form and I'll apply for it for you." Dean filled out the form, paid the money and turned to leave. Dean got off the carriage and went to the 13 castles. He asked the coachman to wait for him. He was stopped by the staff of the temple. "Hello, are you Mr. Dean?" Dean nodded. "This is the invitation letter for you." The staff respectfully handed out a letter. Dean was surprised as he took the letter. There was no signature on it. He didn't open it on the spot. He took out the letter and glanced at it. It was a letter from the 13 castles. They were inviting him to participate in the symposium held in March. The date was 3 days later. The invitation letter was sent 3 days in advance. Most of them wanted to give the architects a buffer time so as not to delay the creation of the invention too suddenly. Dean put away the letter and picked up the bag of letters on the ground. He was ready to go back to the castle and slowly open it. Ryan Castle. 2nd floor. 3 figures came to old Fouline's study room and knocked on the door. The door opened. Sander was the one who opened the door. Old Fouline had arranged a middle-aged maid to stay in the hall because of his old age. Sander was personally in charge of his daily life. "Come." Sander smiled as he saw the 3. The 3 were flattered. "Greetings, young patriarch." Sander smiled and invited the 3 into the room. Old Fouline was sitting on a rattan chair in the study room. He smiled as he looked at the 3 of them. "Your friend Dean has sent you a letter. He wants you to help him. He is short of manpower. You have been with me for a long time. You have seen the basic etiquette, preferences, rules, clothing brands and luxury items of the aristocracy. Now Dean needs you. I hope you can assist him." The 3 were Barton and the other 2. They nodded as they heard Old Fouline's words. Old Fouline smiled. "Go and say hello to him for me." "Yes," Barton replied. The 3 left the study room and went downstairs. They sat in the carriage of the Ryan family. Barton lowered his voice. "We can finally do big things with Dean." "Well," Joseph grinned, "it's uncomfortable to live in this aristocratic house. In the future, we can't call him Dean anymore. Otherwise, we'll expose our root. Well, in the future we will call him Mr. Dean or Master. Although we came out with him, but without Dean there wouldn't be the life we have today. In the past I wouldn't have thought that we would be able to use silk to make rags, milk to wash our faces, and even a small stone would be worth hundreds of thousands of copper coins. Compared to now we are simply raising pigs." Crone's face lit up as he spoke. Barton smiled and said, "You're wrong. The pigs here eat much better than us. They have meat for every meal." Joseph laughed. "Dean, oh no. I should call him young master. He said that he will lead us to great things in the future. Now he is a senior architect of the Temple of Elements. He reports to us every day. He is like a dazzling pearl. We didn't make the wrong choice. We will have good days in the future if we follow him." Crone smiled. "We can't run away from good days. But don't forget the reason why young master brought us here. The first reason is that he trusts us. The second reason is that we have a clean background. It's convenient for us to do things. The last few times young master asked us to do those things. I guess it will be the same in the future. If we make a mistake, then—" Barton's expression turned serious as he said, "What we're doing is shameful. If we're exposed and arrested, we can't drag the young master into this. Without him, we wouldn't be here today, and there wouldn't be a Barton." Joseph and Crone looked at each other. Crone said, "Do you think we are the kind of people who would betray our brothers?" Barton's expression softened. "Of course I understand you. Let's not talk about this. We are almost there. Be careful of the walls." "Well," Joseph nodded, "he should be watched by all parties. There are many spies of other consortia outside the castle." "Master, 3 people have come to see you." Nicholas entered the room and reported. Dean casually said, "Let them in." "Yes." Nicholas turned and left. After a moment, he came back with Barton and the other 2. Dean stopped reading the letter and looked at the 3 of them. There were obvious changes in the 3 of them after a long time. They were no longer timid like they used to be. Their clothes were relatively plain, but they had their own temperament. At first glance it was hard to associate them with the slums. But if he looked closely he could see the flaws in their bodies. For example, Barton had a small lump on his neck. This was an obvious change caused by radiation. Crone's left hand only grew to his elbow. Half of his sleeve was empty. He was a disabled person. Duddian knew that nicotine should have noticed it as well. He looked at the three calmly. Long time no see. Sit down. Although Barton and the other two knew that Dean had the same origin as them, but now that they saw him, the latter's temperament made them feel restrained. It was difficult to call him by his name like before. Barton sat on the chair next to Dean and said, "Dean, Master, what do you want from us?" Dean glanced at him. He didn't correct Barton's address. Instead, he was quite satisfied. Of course, it was not because of his vanity, but from this small matter, he could see that the three of them had indeed grown up. Their characters were a lot more cautious. They didn't recklessly expose their close relationship. He immediately asked, "Barton, do you believe in Holy Church?" Barton was startled. He didn't understand why Duddian was asking this question. He glanced at Nicotine and honestly said, "I'm skeptical." Dean couldn't help but smile as he heard this. Nicholas also smiled and curiously looked at Dean. Dean smiled. "From now on you will believe in the Holy Church." "Ah." Barton blinked in confusion. Dean smiled. "I mean you will enter the Holy Church and become a knight of the Holy Church." Barton was startled. "Master, I also want to do that, but they won't want me." Leave it to me." Dean smiled. "You are only responsible for wholeheartedly loyal to the Holy Church after you enter the Holy Church." Barton suddenly understood. "Young Master, are you planning to place me within the Radiant Church and have me serve you there?" Dean shook his head. "You just need to do what I say and wholeheartedly loyal to the Holy Church. You don't need to think about anything else. You will never know me again. Do you understand?" Barton was somewhat at a loss. He seemed to understand, but at the same time, he didn't. He wanted to ask, but after some hesitation, he held back and said, "I understand." Dean nodded in satisfaction. "What about you? Do you want to be a mighty general?" Joseph was taken aback. "Young Master, you want me to join the military?" "Smart." Duddian smiled. "Just like Barton, you should develop well in the military and forget about me. You just need to think about how to be a good general." Joseph and Barton looked at each other. Although they were at a loss, they nodded. "I know." Dean looked at Crone. "You will follow me." Chapter 321. This is a gift for you. It's up to you to fight for it in the future. Dean waved his hand. Nicholas, who was next to him, took out 3 small porcelain bottles and handed them to him. He pushed the bottles to the front of Barton and the other two. "This is an opportunity for you." Barton and the other two looked at each other. Although they didn't know what was in the bottle, they still stood up and thanked Dean. Dean nodded. The 3 of them had matured a lot under the guidance of old Foulin. "Go and prepare. Use this to improve your body. Butler, take them to rest." "Yes," Nicholas replied. Barton and the other two took their own bottles and left after Nicholas. They went to the guest room on the 2nd floor and closed the door. The 3 of them couldn't help but look at the small porcelain bottle in their hands. Barton twisted the cork open and looked at the light. He saw a pale green liquid. He was startled, and his eyelids suddenly twitched. He said, "This is Spring of Light?" Joseph recalled Dean's previous words. He couldn't help but hold the small porcelain bottle tightly. Crone bit the cork and took a deep breath. He couldn't help but open his eyes and said in surprise, "It should be. I have heard about the water of light before. It is said that this is the holy water of the holy spring of light where the god of light bathed. Can wash away all the dirt in the world, including diseases and plagues. It can also purify the radiation value in the body. Previously, young Master asked us to improve our bodies. This thing must be the water of light. Moreover, if he wants you two to join the Holy Church and the military, if you join with your current body, you won't pass the physical examination, so he will definitely give us the water of light to improve our physique. Barton was startled as he clenched the small porcelain bottle in his hand. Joseph's surprised expression gradually turned into silence. No matter what happens to Dean in the future, I will do my best to help. Crone smiled and said, needless to say, let's try this first. I heard that if you take it orally once a day, 1 drop at a time for about a month, it will greatly reduce the radiation value. If you take 2 drops at a time, the effect will be more obvious. But you can't be greedy. If you take 7 or 8 drops at a time, not only will the effect not improve, but it will also cause harm to the body and even death. Joseph shook the small bottle in his hand and said, there should be a few hundred drops in here. It should be enough to improve our physique. Barton nodded slowly, took a deep breath, and said, from now on, the 3 of us will go our separate ways. But no matter where we go, I hope that our hearts will always be together. Yes. Joseph nodded heavily. That's right, Crone said heroically. The next day, Dudian called Barton and asked him to get in the car with him. After a moment, a stout middle-aged man ran out from the small hall behind the furnace wall. His face was full of beard and his clothes were dirty. There were traces of sewing on the corners of his clothes. His eyes lit up as he saw Dean. He respectfully said, Mr. Dean, how come you are here? Please sit down. Dudian didn't give him a good look. Is it cold today? Do you need your mother to come out to greet the guests? The middle-aged man turned his head and pushed the old woman next to him. Mother, go back to your room. There is nothing for you to do here. Go. The old woman hurriedly said, all right. You talk. Son, talk nicely. Be polite. With that said, she was pushed out of the hall. Dean looked around. It could be described as a poorhouse. The paint on the walls had fallen off. The hanging old clock had long stopped swinging, but it was not repaired, so it was full of dust. The middle-aged man saw Dudian looking around. He took out a chair and wiped it with his sleeve. Mr. Dean, please sit down. Dean didn't bother to be polite with him. He pulled a chair and sat down. Your great-grandfather was a knight who galloped on the battlefield. The foundation he left behind has been passed down to your generation. The spirit of the knight has been contaminated with dust. It's unsightly. The middle-aged man was embarrassed. He didn't dare to answer. Dudian saw the middle-aged man's appearance. He knew that his self-esteem had long been humble. He lost interest in talking. He pointed to Barton. This is the person I'm talking about. From today, he will be transferred to your name. He is your son. He will inherit your surname. The pudgy middle-aged man looked at Barton and suddenly saw that something was wrong. He said awkwardly, Lord, do you see, although I promise to accept this person as my son, after all, I have to pay legal responsibility, and this should be a boy from the slums, this. Dudian glanced at him. He took out a stack of gold notes from his pocket. He took out 10 of them. Each of them had a denomination of 100 gold coins. 10 of them were 1,000 gold coins. He said, This is for your care. It's not a one-time payment. It's only for a year. Do you understand? The middle-aged man's eyes lit up when he saw the gold note. But when he heard Dudian say that it was only for a year, his eyes widened. He quickly said, I understand. I understand everything you said. I'm willing to transfer even 100 of them. Haha, Mr. Dean is really generous. Dudian raised his hand to stop him. But remember, if you reveal too much, then you won't have a good time. The middle-aged man said, I can absolutely guarantee that I will keep my mouth shut. I won't leak even half a word. Dudian turned to Barton. From today on, you will follow his surname. Her Barton. I'll come back to see you in a month. I hope that you have integrated into the family. I'll take you to the night assessment. Barton looked at the ugly middle-aged man in front of him. He didn't expect that this man would be his nominal father. He looked at Dudian. "I'll take care of it." Dudian nodded. He got up and tightened his coat. He left the hall. "Mr. Dean, please sit for a while," the middle-aged man called out as he chased after Dudian. Dudian didn't look back. He waved his hand and went out of the manor. He got on the carriage and left. After returning to the castle, Dudian called Joseph to the carriage and took him to another family. This family was also down and out. The ancestor of the family was a war hero. Although he wasn't a particularly well-known hero, but he was a little hero who had won the banner of bravely kill the enemy. He was an excellent soldier. He was a lieutenant. His foundation wasn't deep. Perhaps he didn't handle the relationship well. After his death, the family was weak from the peak. Now there was only an ancestral house and a banner hanging in the middle of the hall. Every day there would be servants to clean the dust. Although it was faded and somewhat broken, it still looked clean. It was the same as the previous Hull family. In addition to wealth, this family had declined. Dudian had personally selected this family, so he was mentally prepared. This was one of the reasons why he chose this family. After settling Joseph in this family, Dudian left the place. The rest of the matters were left to them. Dudian called Crone back to the castle. One of the reasons was that Crone's arm was deformed. One of the reasons was that Crone had a deformed arm. It would be difficult for him to work with one arm. "This is for you." Dudian took out a stack of gold notes and gave it to Crone. The total value was tens of thousands of gold coins. "Select a group of excellent and capable people to form our own intelligence network. Ask me if you don't understand anything." Crone's eyes lit up as he saw the gold note. He swallowed his saliva. "Master, I don't need so much. The purpose of money is to buy capable people," Dudian replied. Crone put away the gold notes. "I'll be strict with the selection." Dudian waved him back. 2 days later, Dean went to the castle every day to collect 100 pounds of materials. He was ready to return to the castle when he remembered the invitation letter he received last time. He immediately went back to the castle. Dudian went to the main building in the middle of the castle and asked, "Is everyone here?" The staff in front of the temple recognized Dean. "Architects have been here for a long time." "Architect Dean, please come in." Dudian nodded and followed the staff inside. They went all the way to the top floor of the building. Dudian could hear the laughter coming from the conference room. He went over and knocked on the door. The door opened and an unfamiliar middle-aged man appeared. The latter looked at Dudian in confusion. "Architect Dean who won the Epoch Medal?" Dudian nodded with a smile. "Please come in," the middle-aged man said enthusiastically as he saw Dudian admit. The people in the conference room stopped talking as they heard the middle-aged man's words. Dudian saw 7 or 8 people sitting inside the conference room. Tiffany was sitting in the first row of seat. She looked at Dudian with a smile on her face. Dudian glanced at the crowd and nodded. "Dudian greets the elders. You are too polite. We judge heroes by talent. Who will judge by age?" A black-haired old man laughed. Dudian listened to the latter 2 sentences which had the feeling of Chinese style. He looked at him and found that his face was Asian. His heart felt a little familiar. In the giant wall of Sylvia, there were very few Asian faces. Most of them were Western European faces. "Haha, Elder Lin is right." Another middle-aged man laughed. Tiffany waved to Dudian. "Come and sit next to me. Come and sit next to me." "Don't, I have an empty seat," the others said enthusiastically. Dudian smiled and sat down next to Tiffany. "I heard that today is the seminar. It's my first time to participate in it. I hope you can forgive me if I don't understand the rules. It's a small matter. Everyone has their first time." A middle-aged man sitting on Dudian's left side laughed. "Humph." A middle-aged man with a hooked nose snorted. "Everyone knows that today is the seminar. I thought that today is a bootlicking session. If you don't want to talk about inventions, then I'll go back." Chapter 322. The people who tried to strike up a conversation with Dean were embarrassed as they heard the middle-aged man's words. Tiffany looked at the man and whispered to Dean, "Don't be offended. His name is Gusta. His character is like that." Dean smiled. He thought that, if it was just a simple character, then he would be a good person. "Everyone, since almost everyone is here and it's time, let's start today's seminar." Sitting at the head of the table was an old man in his 60s. He was wearing a red cotton-padded jacket and said with a smile. Everyone restrained themselves and revealed serious expressions. The theme of this conference is the same as last time's Plant Illustrated Handbook. Last time we discussed Langi. This time we will be talking about thorn-on, which is ranked 5th among the poisonous plants. This is the basic information of thorn-on. If anyone is familiar with thorn-on, feel free to express your opinion. The old man in the red cotton jacket distributed a stack of information to everyone. Dean took his own copy and passed the rest to the back. He saw a sketch pattern on the material. It was the thorn. What surprised him was that the thorn looked very familiar. It was a plant from China that he had seen in the superchip. It was distributed in the northeast, north, and other places. Its original name was cocklebur. It could be seen in many villages in the north. There is cocklebur in the illustration of the giant wall. It seems that the location of the giant wall is in the old Russian territory. Dean's eyes lit up. Tiffany opened her mouth. Although thorn contains toxins, but as far as I know, there was a report about a doctor who was treating a patient in a remote town. His child picked up thorn to play with and put it into the medicine by mistake. As a result, the patient didn't get poisoned after taking the medicine. Instead, his leprosy, which hadn't been cured for many years, was cured. "Isn't that amazing?" an uncle in his 50s asked in surprise. Dean nodded. The treatment of leprosy was indeed one of the medicinal effects of cocklebur. Although it was poisonous, but the medicinal effect and other economic value were very high. It could be regarded as merit outweighs the demerit. If a small amount of it is poisoned, it will also cause dizziness, nausea, and abdominal pain. If it is used in a war, it might have a pretty good effect, especially in the recent war with the barbarians outside the borders. The paladin Kratos, had already broken through the fortress. If this thing is dried and made into powder and sprinkled in the wind, it should be able to play a greater role in a battle. It can also be considered as a type of large-scale poison-killing magic. The middle-aged man with an aquiline nose who spoke previously had a deep gaze as he slowly said thoughtfully. Dean's heart moved as he heard the words. He was quite interested in the man. "Powder for the enemy." The old man in the red cotton-padded jacket was startled, and his eyes lit up. He clapped his hands and said, "Good idea. Ha! As long as the wind direction is good, it can be used as the poison-killing divine art. Even if there is no wind, it can be used as a human windmill." Man-powered windmill was a new wood-type invention. It was classified as a 4-star medium-grade invention. The creator was a wood master. Dean nodded slightly. It was a good idea, but the toxicity of cocklebur would require a large amount of investment to have an effect. Don't underestimate the difference. A large amount of investment would lead to an extension of time and distance. These 2 points were the key to the war. It was one of the core factors that would affect the outcome of the war. Therefore, the idea of using cocklebur powder in the war was good, but the actual effect was almost negligible. Tiffany, who was next to him, shook her head and said, "If it is thrown into the battlefield, it will be very difficult for the powder to fly far. If the powder is too fine, it will easily be swept away by the wind. If the powder particles are too big, the distance will be reduced. When the enemy reaches the throwing distance, the 2 armies will be in a melee. The powder will hurt their own people." Tiffany shook her head and said, "That's right." Tiffany, who was next to him, shook her head. Her teacher was good at the production of military supplies. Tiffany also majored in this area. She knew that the most important thing about military supplies was the distance. So when she heard the words powder for the enemy, it was the first thing that came to her mind. The others heard Tiffany's words. They thought for a moment and nodded. Yes, it is too risky to use it to make the powder for the enemy. It is not feasible. Gusta snorted as he heard the opposition. If the powder can't be made, then we can turn it into water. Won't the water be affected by the wind? Everyone was startled. The red cotton-padded jacket old man's eyes lit up. Yes, if the powder is too light, then we can put it in a plastic bag and throw it into the battlefield. It will have a miraculous effect. That is a good idea. With this method, wouldn't it be easy for the military to kill the barbarians? Tiffany frowned for a long time but couldn't say anything. Although she felt that there was something wrong, she couldn't say it for a while. Suddenly, her eyes swept to the slender arm next to her. She suddenly remembered the person sitting next to her. She looked at him and saw a smile on his face. It seemed that he was listening with relish. She was slightly disappointed. After all, he was too young and his foundation was too shallow. She whispered, "Dean, do you have any ideas? Why don't you tell us? We can exchange ideas if we don't understand it." Although her voice was soft, the people around heard it. They couldn't help but stop talking. Their eyes gathered on the youngest boy. Dean wanted to listen to their ideas. He hoped to stimulate some inspiration. He didn't expect that Tiffany would pull the fire towards him. He sighed in his heart but smiled as usual. "I have been greatly inspired by the elder's words. I hope you won't make fun of me." "Haha, you are too polite. The wood element is broad and profound. Who would dare to say that they are omniscient and omnipotent? There is no harm in saying it." The old man laughed as he gave Dean a way out. "Yes." The others echoed. Dean nodded. "I think that the value of thorny thorn can be divided into 3 areas. The first is the economic field. The stem fiber can be made into sacks, ropes, and so on. Its seeds can be extracted into essential oil, which can replace tung oil and fat oil. Moreover, it can be processed into raw materials for high-grade spices. In addition, its powder isn't only used on the battlefield. In daily life, it can be used as insect repellent powder. These are the economic values it provides. The second point is the medicinal value. Tiffany said that there was a report that this thing can cure leprosy. Let's not talk about whether the report is true or not. But it is undeniable that there are other things besides toxins. Perhaps it can cure some diseases. So if there is an in-depth study, then we can know whether this thing has the effect of curing leprosy or not. If it can, then its value will be much higher. The third point is the value of war. Whether it is a foreign military war or a war of wealth caused by the first 2 areas, it has no small role. Dean looked around at the crowd and didn't speak again. The conference room fell into a brief silence. In addition to being shocked by this long speech, there were also people who fell into deep thought. As a result, the entire conference room was silent for a few minutes. After a long time, the old man in the red cotton-padded jacket recovered. He clapped his hands and cheered. "Well said." The others reacted and looked at Dean in amazement. They cheered along with the old man in the red cotton-padded jacket. There was a trace of awe in their eyes as they looked at the youth. Not only did they admire Dean's past achievements, but his words just now made them feel the difference between this junior and them. He was quick-witted and had a strong ability to plan. Such a perspective of thinking allowed him to see many things that they couldn't see for a while. They had been immersed in research for decades. They knew that it wasn't their own knowledge that was holding them back, but their way of thinking. Knowledge could be learned, but it was difficult to change the way of thinking. It would determine a person's life. It's the first time that I can see the problem so clearly. Tiffany looked at Dean. There was a trace of admiration and appreciation on her mature and intellectual face. Dean smiled. As a person from the old era, his way of thinking was influenced by the social environment. He liked to categorize things systematically. It would make things clearer and clearer. In the early backward society, the boundaries between many things were very vague. It was difficult to classify the details. There wasn't a strong concept of such things. It seemed that with the development of society and technology, the division of everything was more detailed. It was like the research in the scientific world. From macro to micro, the social system was the same. Mr. Dean's thinking is really quick. Have you studied the thorns in depth before? You actually thought of making hemp rope out of the stem of this thing? I didn't think of this for a while. According to what you said, this little thorn prickly on is simply a treasure. An old man in his 60s sighed. Dean smiled. I'm flattered. I didn't think that a small thorns would have such an effect. If according to Mr. Dean, then the other plants would have endless uses. No wonder Mr. Dean has such achievements at such a young age. I'm convinced. Another middle-aged man laughed. The old man in red jacket smiled. Today's seminar is over. I think the ranking of thorns in the Plant Illustrated Handbook will change. Mr. Dean's analysis of thorns is so thorough. Dean was helpless. He thought that he would be able to hear something interesting today. He didn't expect that it would be a compliment to him. He sighed, but still maintained a smile on the surface. That's all I have to say. I'll listen to the seniors. The old man in red jacket laughed. You don't have to be modest. We are senior architects. Do you have anything else to add about thorns? Everyone looked at each other. The aquiline-nosed old man looked at Dudian and slowly said, If you count the effect of turning the water into water that I proposed, then the effect of the light should be played to the extreme. Yes. The old man in his 60s nodded in agreement. The others immediately seconded the idea. Dean didn't agree with this point. After all, many people had seconded the old man's point of view. Wouldn't it be a slap in the face if he completely overturned it? He would not offend unnecessary people just because of a momentary outburst. Moreover, in real life, people would not submit to you just because you were powerful. If you made others lose face, no matter how powerful you were, they would still hate you and harm you. Therefore, there was a need to have a sense of propriety. The middle-aged man with an aquiline nose saw that Dean didn't have any objection. He said, Since there is no objection, then the results of the seminar will be submitted to the temple. I believe that the people in the temple will give a high evaluation. The old man in the red cotton-padded jacket laughed and said, Just the concept that Mr. Dew proposed is enough to earn us a lot of points. According to our old rules, whoever proposes the conclusion will get the points. The rest of the people will get 10% of the total points as participation points, regardless of whether they express their opinions or not. This time, we will submit a total of 3 points, which are the 3 areas that Mr. Dew just mentioned. All of them will be recorded under Mr. Dew's name. I have no objection. Tiffany was the first to agree. The others also agreed. The hook-nosed middle-aged man's face darkened, and he said, I have no objections to the first 2 theories, but I was the one who suggested the third theory, bloodshed land. Furthermore, Mr. Dew only suggested the theoretical concept of bloodshed land and did not use it in practice. I don't think he is the one who signed this theory, right? The old man in the red cotton-padded jacket was slightly startled. He looked at Dean and saw that the latter was smiling as if he didn't care at all. The old man in the red cotton-padded jacket was slightly relieved. Compared with the hook-nosed middle-aged man, Dean's potential was naturally greater. However, he didn't want to offend the hook-nosed middle-aged man. After all, excluding Dean, the latter was the youngest person in this conference room. Mr. Dean, what do you think? The old man in red jacket asked. Dean laughed. I don't have any objection. The old man in the red cotton-padded jacket heaved a sigh of relief and said, Then it's decided. Let's call it a day. I'll take my leave first. With that, he turned around and left the conference room. The others also said goodbye to Dean and left. Tiffany looked at Dudian. You really are a genius. You can earn points wherever you go. It's very difficult for us to earn points. In the past, the seminar would take a few hours and we wouldn't get any points as a reward. But this time it was over in less than half an hour. Moreover, your theory is very novel. I'm sure that there will be points as a reward. We will be able to benefit from your light and earn some points. Chapter 323. Dean left the castle after saying goodbye to Tiffany. He thought that he could learn from other people's experience and gain something. He didn't expect that the so-called seminar would stay at the basic level. There was no unique innovation. He was quite disappointed. But it wasn't that he didn't gain anything. At least he knew the level of other senior architects. The weaker the others were, the better it was for him. Dean went into his underground laboratory after returning to the castle by carriage. The shark spear that he had made last time had a defect of insufficient launching power. He had thought of a solution in the past few days, although it would cause an uproar if the method was exposed. But he had made the design drawings and the complete model as well as the overall concept. It would be the time to consolidate his position in the temple. Moreover, he needed to use his identity as a member of the temple in order for Barton and Joseph to smoothly enter the military and the Holy Church. The Temple of Elements. In a certain castle. Quipos sat in the chair and gently rubbed his neck. He threw the thesis in front of him aside. Since he had passed the age of 60, his health had been deteriorating day by day. In the past, it was very easy for him to hold the position of reviewing the thesis of a senior oracle. After all, the number of senior oracles was limited, and the time for seminars was even less. Often, there were only 7 or 8 theses in a month, and if there were more than 10, he could finish reviewing them quickly and effortlessly. But now, before he had even finished reading a thesis, he felt his shoulders were sore, his muscles were swollen, and his vision was a little dizzy. He leaned on the chair and gently gasped for breath. He looked at the maid next to him. The maid had served him for many years. She immediately came over to help him massage his shoulders. Alas, I'm getting old. Kempo sighed. He was no longer in the mood to conceive new theurgy. After all, he was a master. If the theurgy he conceived was too low level, it would only lower his value. High-level theurgy required a lot of energy to conceive and produce. He was powerless to do so. He could only impart some of his own inspirations to his students and let them study and produce them. If they became famous, this glory would also accumulate to him. He only needed to review a senior oracle's research paper every few days to receive additional generous rewards from the shrine. However, this dignified and easy task made him feel a little strenuous. He had thought of using his identity to exchange for God's blessing in the Divine Hall to transform his body and restore his vitality. The Divine Hall also advocated this, and even had a discount for old masters like him. However, he had heard some rumors about God's blessing. Coupled with what he had seen and heard, he did not want to touch this filthy thing. The elimination of wood from the market was a big blow to the architects of wood element. It meant that their wood element could be replaced by the metal element. Moreover, it would be better than the metal element. I have been studying the difference between wood and metal recently. I believe that the importance of wood is absolutely greater than that of metal. The old man in the red cotton-padded jacket had a profound look in his eyes. His life's hobby and energy were dedicated to wood. His feelings towards wood were deep in his bones. When he was young, he would hug wood to sleep every day. He couldn't accept that cold metal could replace wood. The middle-aged man with an aquiline nose snorted. He was about to say something when suddenly a carriage came from outside. A man came down from the carriage. It was the middle-aged butler who had been in front of Quipos. He saw Tiffany and the other 3 people in the manor. His eyes lit up as he strode towards them. "Why are you so leisurely?" The old man in the red cotton-padded jacket was obviously very familiar with him. He was surprised when he saw him. "You finished the review so quickly?" "Well, Master Quipos was reviewing another paper today. You happened to catch up with him, so you reviewed it together," the middle-aged butler said with a smile. Tiffany laughed. "That's good luck. Let us have a look. What is the result?" The middle-aged butler smiled and handed the paper to her. "You read it first. I have something to do. See you later." Then he turned around and left. He got on the carriage and went straight out of the castle. As the carriage drove away, Tiffany quickly opened the wrapping paper on the outside of the paper. She quickly glanced at the comments and rewards at the end. She was surprised. 200 points? So many points? The old man in the red cotton-padded jacket moved closer to take a look and was also surprised. He said with joy, "Just the first one is worth 200 points. This is equivalent to the points of a 2-star divine art work. Wouldn't it be 600 points if there are 3 of them? Take out 10% and give it to us. We can get more than a dozen points." Ha ha! The hooked-nosed middle-aged man's heart skipped a beat. Although he was a high-ranking architect, it was still a big profit to get 200 points from a seminar. After all, even as a high-ranking architect, it was not easy to produce a 2-star divine technique. Tiffany sighed. Just the thorn plant has so many points. If we write down all the other plants in the Plant Illustrated Handbook, wouldn't we be able to get master's points? The old man in the red cotton-padded jacket smiled. "You are thinking too much. This time we gave 200 points. It should be because of the use of this thinking. Any plant can be analyzed and used according to this thinking. So if we use this method to study the next plant, I estimate that we can get 10 consolation points." That's true. Tiffany opened the second chapter and saw that it was still 200 points. There was also a hint of appreciation in the comment. But when she opened the third chapter, a smile appeared on her face. She blinked her eyes and looked again. There was no point reward. The comments were very simple, not feasible. The aquiline-nosed middle-aged man guessed that the third paper was his. His heart jumped as he saw Tiffany's stunned expression. He was pleasantly surprised. Could it be that he didn't get 200 points? Tiffany looked up at him and saw the surprise in his eyes. The corners of her mouth twitched as she took out his paper and handed it to him. The aquiline-nosed middle-aged man quickly looked at the paper. His heart was filled with excitement. He was stunned on the spot. When the old man in the red cotton-padded jacket saw his expression, he immediately consoled him. "Since Master Kpo says it's not feasible, it means that there's still some problem here. I think if we want to understand more, we should visit the military and understand more. Perhaps we'll know where the problem lies." The aquiline-nosed middle-aged man's face turned blue and red. He gripped the paper and left. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. Dudien got up on time. He ate breakfast while reading the newspaper. At the same time, he told Nicholas to rent a mammoth carriage. He also told him to prepare some wrapping cloth. Military newspaper. The barbarians have occupied the Red Maple Mountains. The terrain is easy to defend and difficult to attack. The military launched the 4th night attack at 7 o'clock yesterday. The effect was obvious and the barbarians were defeated. It is reported that the barbarians are coming to the Red Maple Mountains. The army hasn't occupied the Red Maple Mountains yet, but they were attacked again. Dudien glanced at the newspaper. He was in a high position and had many exchanges with old Foulin. He had learned how to read the newspaper. The 4th night attack was true, but the barbarians were defeated. It was likely that they were only able to annihilate a small team. Moreover, he had seen the map and deduced the terrain of the Red Maple Mountains. According to the number of troops sent by the military, it would be too difficult to attack the Red Maple Mountains unless they sent the guards. If the guards were dispatched, then it would be recorded in the newspaper. But it didn't mention the guards. So it was difficult to attack the Red Maple Mountains by relying on the surface soldiers of the military. He had guessed the purpose of the military. They were ready to carry out the final defense at the walls of the living area. The current attack on the Red Maple Mountains was just a symbolic harassment to express their duties. They didn't want to be gossiped by consortiums or Holy Church. As for why would they rely on the walls of the living area to defend? In the past few days, Dean had been thinking about this problem. Chapter 324. Dean slightly frowned as he looked at him. Don't let others hear this in front of me. Otherwise they will think that I told you this. It won't be good for us if it spreads out. Sergei replied, What are you afraid of? They are the enemies that are blocking our way. We are also enemies to them. Are you afraid that they will know about this? Dean said, Everyone is an enemy, but there is a priority. If you are too ostentatious, then there will always be people who don't like you. They will push your ranking forward. Sergei was startled and didn't speak anymore. Gwyneth looked at Dean. Master, the barbarians have occupied the Red Maple Mountains. They have burned and looted all the residents in the nearby towns. It seems that they aren't in a hurry to attack the residential areas. There will be more innocent sacrifices if this continues. Should we do something? Dean looked at her. What do you mean? Although I don't know much about you, but I can see that young master has a lot of energy. If you contribute, then you may be able to improve the situation of the battlefield or push the military to launch the attack earlier. Gwyneth stared at Dean as she slowly said. When Sergei heard this, he laughed strangely. I can't tell that you still have such a compassionate heart after being tortured in the Thorn Flower prison. No wonder you were a disciplinary enforcer before you entered the prison. You really have a noble character and a kind heart. Gwyneth narrowed her eyes as she glanced at him. Sergei's eyelids twitched. He smiled and shrugged his shoulders. He didn't talk much. Dean quietly looked at the girl who was the same age as him. You overestimate me. Although I have some weight, but it's difficult to influence the entire border war with my own strength. Moreover, what are the benefits for me? Gwyneth stared at him. There are many benefits. If you win the war, you will harvest honor and the love of the people. I believe that the military will be able to eradicate the barbarians once the war is launched. Even if the military can't do it, they will ask for help from the inner wall. Once the inner wall intervenes, then the barbarians will be destroyed. Honor and love. Dean smiled. Do you know that a word can change a person's life? A word can make a person die. The so-called honor and love don't need to take such a big risk to get them. Gwyneth said, The biggest benefit is that you will have peace of mind. Do you want to watch innocent civilians die? Dean looked into her deep eyes. There was a trace of surprise in his heart. He didn't expect that the girl who had crawled out of hell would have such a kind heart. He could feel that the latter wanted him to help from the bottom of her heart, but at the same time, he could feel a strong killing intent and hatred from the girl. Could it be that after suffering all kinds of torture, her hatred didn't spread, and she was still focused on her enemies? He was silent for a moment but calmly said, I can. Gwyneth was startled as she heard his answer. Her face turned pale. She gently bit her lips as she bowed her head and clenched her fists. Sergei, Nicholas and Jean heard Dudien's words. They couldn't help but look at the youth. Although they would ignore it if they were in Dudien's position, but they still felt a chill when they heard the calm and ruthless words from the youth's mouth. Dean's eyes flashed as he looked at the girl's slightly trembling fist. But it's not that difficult to control the war. Sergei, Nicholas and Jean were surprised as they looked at Dudien. This was a race war that would decide the life and death of civilians in 3 regions. Even the 6 consortiums were just small characters in this war. How could Dudien have a way to deal with it? Gwyneth's body trembled as she looked at Dean. Her eyes were filled with pain and expectation. Dean slowly said, I can't control the military's attack, but I have some ways to influence the barbarians' attack. However, according to the current situation, the barbarians aren't stupid. They know that attacking the residential area is just a target for arrows. So they occupy the Red Maple Mountains and wait for the reinforcements to come. Then they will take the opportunity to loot the small towns in the suburb. This is inevitable. Gwyneth's eyes were full of disappointment. So no matter who wins or loses, those people will die? Dean shrugged. There is no such thing as must die in my dictionary. The barbarians can loot the small towns. We just need to move the residents of the small towns to the residential area before the barbarians. Then we will be able to shelter them. But the process is quite troublesome and will take up a lot of my time. But your time can save the lives of countless people. Gwyneth couldn't help but be excited. Dean smiled. You are wrong. It isn't my time, but anyone's time can save the lives of countless people. It's just that they are willing or not. Obviously no one is willing to do such a troublesome thing. Isn't it comfortable to have afternoon tea at home? Gwyneth stared at him. Her face was ugly as she bit her teeth. Dean saw her expression and smiled. You don't have to hate me. Since you want to save them, even if I stop you, you will secretly follow them. Even if I tie you up at home, you may not be loyal to me in the future. So, this time I will save them as you wish. Gwyneth's eyes widened. Are you really willing? Dean said. I can give them a chance to be redeemed. But whether they can survive or not depends on you. I will give you my letter and send a letter to the New World Consortium. They will communicate with the city defense and open a green channel to let the people from the small towns in. As for you and Sergei, you are responsible for going to the small towns and spread the news. Bring the noble emblem of the Ryan family and gather them. There was a trace of surprise in Gwyneth's eyes. She wanted to say something but soon restrained herself. She took a deep breath and said, Thank you. Dean smiled and looked at Nicholas. Pen and letter. Nicholas immediately called for a maid and had her pen, ink, and letter prepared. Dean quickly wrote 2 letters and gave them to Gwyneth. Send them to the Ryan family. Patriarch Feline will know what to do. Thank you. Gwyneth thanked him again and left. Sergei sighed helplessly. I haven't had enough of being a villain. This time, I have to join the rescue operation. How unlucky. Although he said that, he still lifted his body and followed Sergei. Nicholas whispered to Dean after the 2 left. Master, they are going to evacuate the people from the small towns. It is a race against time. If you borrow the emblem of a big aristocrat, you have a good relationship with you, then it will be more prestigious. The Ryan family used to be a top aristocrat a few decades ago, but it has been declining for decades. After 2 generations of decline, their reputation has long been thin. I'm afraid that the people in the small towns won't know about them. There will inevitably be resistance and riot. I'm afraid that it will affect the efficiency of the rescue. Dean indifferently smiled. It's their business how much they can save. But it's our business who should be thanked after they are rescued. Do you want me to contribute and come up with ideas, but in the end it will be someone else who will be thanked? Nicotine was startled for a moment, his expression changing slightly as he hurriedly lowered his head. Young master is right. Dean looked at him. Nicholas felt Dean's gaze but didn't dare to look up. He felt the hairs on his body stand up. It was like a prey being stared at by a crocodile. His muscles were slightly stiff as he maintained a humble posture. After a moment he heard Dean's dull voice. This time we are going to hunt monsters outside the giant wall. You should keep up. Nicholas's heart shrank as he looked up at Dean. There seemed to be a kind of irresistible majesty in Dean's eyes. His face slightly changed. He almost forgot the words that were on the tip of his tongue. Fortunately, he had been a butler for many years. He hurriedly said, Master, I can't stand going outside the giant wall. Although I took the risk to take God's blessing, and my physique is barely comparable to an intermediate hunter. But I don't know anything about fighting. Moreover, I'm old and my endurance won't be able to keep up. If I go outside the giant wall, I will only drag you down. If I accidentally disturb the monsters and bring trouble to you, it will bring you suffering. I know that I made a mistake last time, but I have changed. Now I'm loyal to you wholeheartedly. I hope you can give me another chance. Dean slowly said, My words are like a burning fire. Only the ashes are allowed to stay. I will directly use the carriage to drag them. Nicholas indifferently said. The soldier said, This carriage is easy to be attacked by mutant beasts outside the fortress. What mutant beasts can attack it with me here? Nicholas glanced at him and jumped into the carriage. I'm in a hurry. Hurry up. The soldier smiled and ran back to the fortress gate. He waved to his companion to open the gate. The mammoth carriage left the fortress under the eyes of everyone. Dean jumped out from the back of the carriage after more than 10 miles. He waved to Nicholas. Nicholas understood and hurriedly crawled to his side, putting on a smile and returning the 2 medals with both hands. Dean put it into his armor and let the coachman of the carriage go straight. The carriage had been bought by him. Even if it was sacrificed in the radiation zone outside the fortress, it didn't matter. As for the coachman, he would be sent to the underworld outside the giant wall. He didn't want the matter to be leaked to the ears of other consortiums if he was questioned by the courier station. The mammoth carriage was huge. It attracted the attention of mutant beasts after entering the radiation zone. Dudian sat on the head of the mammoth and let nicotine kill it. With his physique as an intermediate hunter, it was easy for him to kill a few mutant beasts. But not all of these mutant beasts were small characters. There were many senior hunters who went out but disappeared in the radiation zone and were judged to be dead. It could be seen that there were some terrible mutant beasts, but the number was very small. It would only happen once in a decade. If he encountered it, he could only blame his bad luck. Chapter 325. Dudien's eyes lit up as he thought of something. He jumped down from the mammoth's head as the carriage approached. He looked at the 2 Knights of Light. What are you doing? One of the middle-aged Knights of Light didn't answer Dean's words. He looked up and down at Dean. He frowned. Are you hunters from the New World Consortium? Yes. There have been frequent anomalies in the passage outside the giant wall. There are traces of giant monster activity outside. Are you going out to hunt? I advise you to go back so that you won't be treated as a free meal by the giant monsters outside the passage. The middle-aged Knight of Light indifferently said. Dean smiled. Thank you for reminding us. But we are under the orders of the consortium. We can't make our own decisions. Humph. The middle-aged Knight of Light snorted. If you insist on going out, then don't blame me for not warning you if you lose your life. Dean was used to the sarcastic words of the Knight of Light. He smiled. Then I will trouble you to help me open the passage. Courting death. A young knight muttered in displeasure. Although his voice was a bit low, but it was obvious that everyone present could hear him. The other Knights of Light looked at Dean and Nicotine with a bit of disdain and ridicule in their eyes. A thin youth who was standing in the back stared at Dean suspiciously. He couldn't help but exclaim, Are you Architect Dean? Dean nodded. Yes, it's me. The middle-aged knight, the young knight and the others looked at Dean in amazement. They didn't expect that the famous genius would be standing in front of them. Although they were familiar with Dean's name, but they didn't have much free time to read newspapers. Therefore they didn't recognize Dean's appearance. Dean didn't want to delay here for too long. He took out his architect's medal and hunter's medal and showed them to the middle-aged knight. I'm here to escort our consortium's hunters to establish a stronghold outside the giant wall. I'll have to trouble you to open the way. The middle-aged knight politely said, I've heard that Architect Dean has a good relationship with the New World Consortium. I didn't expect you to be responsible for establishing a stronghold for their hunters. You are really versatile. Dean knew that the middle-aged knight didn't know much about him. The temple had deliberately covered up his identity as a hunter. At the same time, he rarely appeared in noble gatherings and didn't stir up any big movements. He glanced at the middle-aged knight. You are a member of the Char family. Give my regards to your family head. The middle-aged knight's eyes lit up. I didn't expect you to have heard of my family. It's an honor. You are too polite. Dean looked back at the mammoth carriage and said to Nicholas, Get ready to unload the goods. Nicholas was secretly surprised as he saw the conversation between Dean and the middle-aged knight. He had never seen the arrogant Knights of Light being so polite and humble to others. He nodded and turned to leave. The middle-aged knight looked at Dean and ordered the Knights of Light to open the passage door. "Architect Dean, this passage isn't safe. You have a distinguished body, so let the hunter do the rough work. We can't afford the responsibility if anything happens to you." Dean patted his shoulder. "Don't worry. I'll be back soon." The middle-aged knight smiled. He wanted to continue to persuade Dean, but Dean raised his hand to stop him. The middle-aged knight sighed and waved to the Knights of Light to assist Nicholas in unloading the goods. The shark spears rolled in coarse cloth were lifted one by one. The heavy weight made the Knights of Light speechless. They were full of curiosity but didn't dare to peek because Dean was standing next to them. Soon all the things were unloaded from the carriage. Dean asked Nicotine to move to the passage. After everything was piled up in the passage, he said goodbye to the middle-aged knight and entered the passage. He closed the heavy passage door. Under the dim light of the oil lamps in the tunnel, the rock walls on both sides of the tunnel were engraved with magnificent war pictures of humans and monsters. They looked slightly ferocious in the dark and overlapping light. In the middle of the tunnel, there were two beautiful and graceful goddesses who were staring at the people under the wall with smiles on their faces. Nicholas was full of curiosity as he came to the giant wall passage for the first time. Dean urged him. Both of them moved the shark spear to the exit on the other side of the passage. Dean took off the lock and sniffed along the gap. The air was filled with a very faint smell. It was mixed with the smell of Splitter. His eyes narrowed. Splitter really came here. Judging from the concentration of the smell, the latter shouldn't be here at the moment. Dean slowly opened the giant door. A narrow sky came into view. He looked around and saw a few huge dents on the ground. He recognized that they were the footprints of Splitter. Dean's muscles slightly tightened as he looked around. Once he left the door, he would be completely isolated from the safe environment. Once Splitter sensed him, then there would be no possibility of survival. The magic marks of Splitter were very strong and had a wide range of smell. Dean quietly sniffed for 10 minutes. He saw that there was no movement, so he opened the giant door. He waved to Nicholas to move the shark spears to the ground outside. His eyes were always vigilant while moving the spears. If Splitter suddenly appeared, then he would immediately drill into the passage to escape. The size of the passage was too small for Splitter to squeeze in. Nicholas looked around while moving the shark spears. In his more than 60 years of life, he had heard of the outside world countless times, but he had never seen it with his own eyes. Although he was different from some of the boys and girls who had hope of exploring the outside world, but his heart was full of curiosity. At the moment he had the opportunity to see it with his own eyes. He could vaguely see a desolate ruin. Weeds were growing everywhere. It seemed that someone had lived here. Shocked, he turned his head and looked around. Suddenly, his pupils shrank and he almost screamed. After holding back his uncontrollable scream, he hurriedly pulled Dean and pointed to the entrance behind them. Dean looked back and his face suddenly changed. On the towering wall behind the passageway, there were more than a dozen scratches that were several inches deep, crisscrossing each other. Each scratch was more than 10 meters long, some even more than 20 meters long. It was not hard to imagine what kind of giant creature had caused this damage. Dean took a deep breath. He was shocked by the destructive power of Splitter. He was shocked by the hardness of the giant wall. No wonder it was able to shelter humans for 300 years. It had been more than 300 years since he had awakened, but the giant wall was still intact. He had never heard the news that the giant wall had been damaged. Nicotine's shock was hard to conceal. He had heard countless stories about monsters, but he never thought that there would be such a terrible thing. He couldn't imagine the monster that had caused such long scratches. What kind of shape did it have? Dean gently put the shark spear on the ground and came to the front of the giant wall. He looked up at the lowest sharp mark. From the groove of the sharp mark, he could see the rough stone particles. The giant wall seemed to be made of stone. There was nothing special about it. But how could a giant wall made of sand and stone have such a high defensive strength? How could it withstand the attack of the monster for more than 300 years? Not to mention the height of the giant wall was more than 100 meters. Just the visual estimation of the ground was more than 1,000 meters. If he fell halfway, he would die. Although he had considered using an air cushion, but if he fell from a height of 400 or 500 meters, then even an air cushion wouldn't be able to save his life. He had to rely on the suckers in his hands. Therefore, these 4 suckers were the result of repeated experiment. He had put a lot of effort in the aspect of abrasion resistance. In theory, it was possible to continuously climb a distance of thousands of meters. If I wasn't worried that the splitter would make too much noise, I would have directly made a hot air balloon with a jet gun. Then I would be able to easily fly up the giant wall. But there are still risks. The pressure of the hot air balloon at a height of 700 or 800 meters is too much for the current materials. Once it breaks, I would die faster. On the ground, Nicholas looked up at the figure flying away from the giant wall. He was completely shocked. With only 2 small tools, he was able to climb to such a terrifying height with his bare hand. It was simply unheard of. After a moment, Dean had climbed to a height of more than 400 meters. His right hand was sore and swollen. He estimated that his left hand was almost the same. Both of his hands grasped the suckers and slightly gasped for breath. He continued to climb up. Each time he would stick the suckers to the giant wall so as not to fall off. Nevertheless, when he climbed to 600 meters, Dean's left hand loosened and the suckers fell off. He was scared to death. Cold sweat instantly permeated his body. He quickly controlled the strength of his right hand and stabilized it on the wall. Once again he waved his left hand to slap the suckers on the wall. After this frightening moment, Dean paid more attention to the suckers on his left hand. He didn't look up to see how high it was. He just kept climbing up. He didn't know how long it took. Suddenly he felt the light above his head was much brighter. He looked up and saw the sky close to him. The top of the giant wall was only dozens of meters away from him. He was excited. He stabilized the rhythm of his hands and feet and continued to climb up. Soon he finally came to the top of the giant wall. He raised his hand to grab the edge and climbed up. He looked around and found that the top of the giant wall was a bit similar to the Great Wall of his motherland. There were slightly raised edges on both sides. In the middle was a wide aisle of more than 20 meters. There were no weapons on it. It was very clean. Dean exhaled and looked up at the front. He suddenly had a feeling of overlooking all living beings. He opened his arms and felt the cold wind blowing on his face. His hair was curled back. He felt comfortable and comfortable. After experiencing the feeling of standing on the top of the giant wall for a while, Dean looked down at Nicotine. The distance of more than a kilometer was still clearly visible to him. He could even see Nicotine's beard. He smiled and unloaded the big bag he was carrying. There was a circle of finger-thick rope inside. He untied it and wrapped one end around a boulder on the edge of the giant wall. The other end was thrown down. The length of the rope was 1,200 meters. He calculated it according to the height of the giant wall. In order to avoid visual errors, he added more than 100 meters in length. Soon, the rope fell to the ground at Nicotine's feet. Nicotine looked up at Dean, who was overlooking from the top of the giant wall. The shock on his face was still difficult to calm down. He took a deep breath and picked up another huge bag on the ground. He tied it with the rope and stepped back a few steps. Dean saw him tied it and immediately pulled the rope. After a moment, the huge bag was lifted up. He untied the bag. There was still a rope inside, but it was not the previous lighter rope. Instead, it was a thick rope as thick as a wrist. It was extremely heavy. According to the law, Dean untied the thick rope. The thin rope was useless, so he threw it on the ground. After the thick rope was put down, Nicotine immediately bent the rope into a triangle shape and tied the shark spear to it. After he tied it, Dean pulled it up. After a moment, the first shark spear was pulled to the top of the giant wall, then the second one, the third one. After all 12 shark spears were moved to the top of the giant wall, the next step was to launch the super cannon. The super cannon was not assembled. It was wrapped in a coarse cloth. The rope was tied to the cloth. It was lifted to the top of the giant wall. Then the coarse cloth and the thick rope were thrown down together. The other small parts were also put into the cloth and lifted to the giant wall. As time passed, all the tools that were brought were carried to the giant wall. Dean threw down the thick rope. He was gasping for breath while looking at the distant wilderness. Suddenly, he saw a black dot coming from the distance. It was like an ant running at full speed. He squinted his eyes and looked at it. The latter was running closer and he could see its appearance. "It's it!" Dean's pupils shrank. He didn't expect that it would appear before he could use the Splitter's plasma shell to lure it. The moment Splitter's body slammed into the wall, it quickly came to a stop. The eyeball in the middle of its back quickly noticed Nicotine, who was still hanging in the air. It let out a low roar and fiercely jumped up. Seeing its body dilate in its pupils, Nicotine was scared out of his wits, his eyes wide with terror. Whoosh! A huge, scythe-like arm quickly chopped down like a giant sword. No! Nicotine looked at Splitter, who was jumping high up in the air. The two of them were almost parallel to each other, so he instantly saw the terrifying posture of his opponent. An unprecedented fear gripped his heart tightly, and he screamed. He instinctively wanted to let go of the rope and let his body fall down. He didn't even have time to think about whether he would fall to his death or not. He only hoped that he could avoid the attack in front of him. However, he had wrapped the rope around his waist too tightly, so he couldn't untie it. Whoosh! At this moment, the rope was swung in vain. Bang! The scythe-like arm brushed past Nicholas's eyes, and the strong wind it brought about hurt his eyeballs. Then, a loud sound came from the giant wall behind him, but the scythe-like arm had struck the giant wall. Nicholas felt as if he were floating in the air. He swayed to the other side and narrowly avoided the blow. Boom! The next moment, a huge roar echoed from below. It was the sound of Splitter falling down again. The ground caved in. Nicotine was relieved. He looked down and saw that Dudian was about to jump again. His face turned pale with fright. He quickly bit the bundle and used both hands to climb the rope. In just a few seconds, Nicotine had risen more than 100 meters. His arms were alternately pulling the rope, and in just a few seconds, Nicotine had risen more than 100 meters. Whoosh! The Splitter jumped again. Nicotine's heart jumped as he saw the momentum of the Splitter's jump. He hurriedly stamped his feet on the giant wall and used the momentum to move away. Dean, who was on top of the giant wall, was prepared. He ran to the other side and swung the Nicotine to the other side according to the previous method. Bang! Splitter's scythe hit the giant wall again. Dean was relieved and hurriedly pulled the scythe at full speed. When the Splitter jumped for the third time, Nicotine had already climbed to a height of more than 500 meters. This time, the Splitter only jumped to about 350 meters before falling down. Obviously, this was already the limit of its jumping. Although its jumping ability was very strong, its weight was also very huge. It was just like how an elephant's strength was the strongest in the forest, but it did not dare to jump. Nicotine was relieved as he saw that the Splitter couldn't touch him. But he still didn't dare to stay. He grabbed the rope and quickly climbed up. The Splitter stood under the giant wall. It seemed to look up but didn't jump again. Dean was relieved as he saw the Splitter. Although the Splitter had wings, but its body was too big. Its thin wings shouldn't be used for flying. It should be used to fight on land to make the body more flexible. Otherwise, the Splitter would have used its wings to fly up the giant wall. After a moment, Nicotine was pulled up the giant wall. Nicotine grabbed the edge and sat on the ground. He was panting and sweating. His face was still pale. It was obvious that he was still in shock. Dean quickly took back the rope and kicked Nicotine. "Don't dawdle. Hurry up and move the things." Nicholas sat on the ground and turned to look at Dudien. He saw that Dudien's left hand was torn by the friction of the rope. Blood was sliding down his index finger, but he didn't feel it. Nicholas's anger dissipated, but there was a complex look in his eyes. He stood up and said, "Thank you." Dean glanced at him. "Don't flatter yourself. I was afraid that the things in the bag would fall." Nicotine's mouth slightly twitched as he secretly smiled. He didn't say much as he carried the bag to the shark lance that was 100 meters away. He picked up the shark lance and said to Dean, "This guy is right below us. We can directly launch from here. Where else do we need to move it?" Dean said, "This is the entrance of the passage. If the movement is too big, then the Knights of Light will be alarmed." Nicotine choked and said honestly, "Then where do you think we should move to?" "Over there. 5 kilometers away." Dean pointed to the left. Nicotine smiled. He knew that there was no room for discussion. He picked up the shark lance and walked towards the direction. Dean held the shark lance and walked towards the giant wall. He looked down and saw that Splitter was standing in front of the giant wall. It was waving its scythe at the giant wall and making rustling sounds. He retracted his eyes and moved forward. More than 10 minutes later, all the tools, including the shark spear, were moved to a place 5,000 meters away from the left side of the tunnel. Chapter 328. Roar. A low roar came from under the giant wall. Splitter's plasma powder fell to a height of about 600 or 700 meters. Splitter roared as if it had sensed something. It turned around and ran towards Dean's position. The ground rumbled and trembled. The footprints of the Splitter were left along the way. In less than half a minute, the Splitter rushed to the bottom of the giant wall. It looked up at the blood powder bag tied to the rope. It roared in anger. Even though the Splitter knew that it couldn't climb up, its voice was sharp and vigorous. Even though the Splitter knew that it couldn't climb up, it still made people's heartbeat fluctuate and pores shrink. Dean firmly grabbed the rope and descended vertically. According to the height shown by the previous Nicotine jump, he hung the rope to a height of about 400 meters. He gently shook the rope to let the smell of the plasma powder spread out. At the same time, he deliberately tempted the Nicotine. Splitter roared and leaped into the air. Dean immediately pulled the rope and threw it up to a height of 70 or 80 meters. Splitter jumped to a height of nearly 400 meters, but it still couldn't touch the rope. Dean stabilized the rope and slowly lowered it. At the same time, the thin wings on Splitter's back spread out, reducing the force of the fall. At the same time, the scythe slashed on the wall, using the friction to reduce the speed of its body's descent. Even so, when it landed, it still let out a loud sound like an earthquake. Dean grabbed the rope and continued to move to the left. He didn't want to be heard by the Knights of Light. Splitter ran after the rope and suddenly jumped up. Dean pulled the rope again and threw it high into the sky. The rope head suddenly rose dozens of meters, making it fall into the air. "Young master, how do we do this?" Nicholas was assembling the super launch cannon, holding a huge pedestal in his hands as he hurriedly asked. Dean looked at it and said, "There are 2 20-centimeter long iron bolts next to it. Connect it to the ground and tighten the screws. Don't let it get loose." Nicotine heard Dean's words and immediately got busy. Dean stopped and grabbed the rope to continue to lure Splitter. Splitter repeatedly jumped a few times. He saw Dean put down the rope again. He looked up and roared a few times in anger. But he didn't try to jump again. Apparently, he realized that it was futile. Dean lowered the rope by dozens of meters and kept shaking. Splitter couldn't hold back as it saw the shaking rope. It jumped higher this time. Dean was surprised. He hurriedly threw the rope to the side. As the rope was raised, it swung sideways and shifted its direction. Splitter suddenly missed its target. The wings on its back spread wide, and its scythe-like arms rapidly chopped at the huge wall to reduce its falling speed. It let out a low squeak and landed on the ground with a loud bang. The ground shook violently, and its body also flipped backwards. It swayed on the ground for a while and then slowly got up. Green liquid seeped out from the joints of its legs, which were as sharp as a spider's legs. Seeing this, Dean immediately knew that it was injured. There was a touch of smile on his face. Being able to injure a legendary monster with a hunting level of 68, it was estimated that it could scare a lot of hunters. Dean continued to use the plasma powder on the rope to lure it and consume its physical energy. Splitter looked up and roared in a low voice. However, he did not continue to jump. Dean slowly lowered the rope from 300 meters to 200 meters. Once again the Splitter became angry and pounced on him. He pulled with all his might, but this time, he was unable to dodge Splitter's scythe. Splitter's scythe slashed onto the thin rope, and it was immediately cut in half. Dean took back the rope and poured out a small cluster of blood powder. He wrapped it in a piece of white gauze and tied it to the rope as bait. Splitter pounced on the broken rope as it landed on the ground. After a moment it looked up at Dudian and roared. Its voice was sharp, full of anger and killing intent. Dean smiled and threw the rope to about 300 meters. He continued to lure Splitter. Splitter didn't jump again. Dean didn't continue to fall. Both of them consumed each other. After a moment, Nicotine finally finished assembling the cannon. Dean called Nicotine. Use this to tease it. Lead it to attack and consume its strength. Nicotine was stunned. He stretched his neck and looked at the ground. He saw Splitter roaring on the ground. Its body was covered with sharp blades. Nicotine retracted his head and looked at Dean. Will this work? Just do as I say. Dean handed the rope to it and went to the front of the super battery. He pushed the battery to the edge of the giant wall. The edge was only half the height of a person. The base of the battery was 30 centimeters high. There were 8 lifting tubes on the base which were 2 meters long. It was easy to push the barrel to the edge of the giant wall. The barrel could be adjusted 270 degrees, so that the base was close to the edge, so that the barrel could aim vertically at the bottom of the giant wall. Dean picked up a shark spear. The body of the shark spear was tungsten steel, but the tip was dark black. In addition, the shark spear was different from the ones he had smelted. There was a small metal cylinder fixed behind the shark fin on the back of the spear. At this moment, he inserted the shark spear into the barrel, covered the muzzle with the soft rubber net that he had prepared beforehand, and adjusted the barrel to a straight downward angle. The tip of the shark spear slowly slid out of the soft rubber net, causing it to bulge slightly, but it didn't break. Dean opened the barrel and aimed at the Splitter. He took out a match and was ready to ignite the fuse. He didn't act but whispered to Nicotine, "Lure it to jump. Lower the rope but not too low." Nicotine had seen the scene of the cannon firing the shark spear last time. He understood Dean's intention. Nicotine's eyes lit up as he controlled the rope to lower it. He kept swaying the rope to provoke Splitter. When the rope was lowered to 250 meters, Splitter seemed to be unable to endure Nicotine's continuous lashing and swinging. It jumped once again. Good opportunity. Dean was happy when he saw the Splitter was ready to jump. He had some understanding of the jumping posture of the Splitter. He immediately ignited the primer behind the barrel with a match. The fuse of the primer quickly burned into the barrel. Dean tightly held the handles on both sides of the barrel to prevent the impact from changing the position of the barrel. This kind of non-fixed barrel was more likely to be affected by the impact of the firepower and would deviate. Whoosh! Splitter jump! Bang! The muzzle spurted out a flame. Crash! At the same time, the sound of chains suddenly rang out. The tungsten steel shark spear broke through the soft rubber net in a flash and flew straight down. The chain and the round metal base behind the shark spear that was caught by the net were instantly blown out. The huge momentum pushed the tungsten steel shark spear forward at a high speed. At the same time, the momentum also tore the rope net that was holding the chain. Before the chain could scatter, it was pulled by the shark's spear and pulled into a jet-black line. At the same time, the small metal cylinder tied to the back of Shark Lance, under this strong pressure, a small hidden buckle at the front of the cylinder suddenly popped up, and the end of the cylinder fiercely spewed out a huge white wave of air. Steam jet. This was the run-up device that Dean thought of. If it was shot on the ground, it could make the shark spear fly for at least 50 meters. At this moment, with the help of gravity, the speed of Shark Lance's descent was extremely fast. With the help of the steam jet, it was like a black shark shadow, sticking close to the giant wall as it swam downward. In an instant, it had crossed over 1,000 meters of the giant wall. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. At the moment, Splitter had just cut the rope and was falling down. Whoosh! The tungsten steel shark spear whistled towards the shark spear. Splitter shrieked in the air, as if he had felt the coldness of shark spear's attack. He raised his scythe-like arms in front of his body, while the other 4 scythe-like arms were slightly spread out, as if he was going to attack Shark Spear head-on. The moment the two collided, Splitter's 4 scythe-like arms fiercely chopped down with the force of 10,000 caddies. However, the weight of the Shark Spear, the momentum of the full-speed launch, and the power of the steam jet had long since reached an extremely frightening level. The destructive power it carried was far beyond Splitter's expectations. Puff! The scythe-like arms were shaken off. The tungsten steel shark spear instantly pierced through the scythe-like arms in front of its body. Its falling body was unable to adjust its falling posture. It fiercely smashed to the ground. Dean's calm expression revealed a pleasant surprise. He didn't expect that his first attack would be successful. He didn't check the injuries of Splitter. He quickly loaded the second shark spear. The whole action took less than 3 seconds. He had carried the second shark spear to the side when he had launched the first one. It was convenient to load the second shark spear. He rubbed the match and ignited the ignition. He grabbed the barrel and aimed at Splitter. Chapter 329. Boom! A deafening blast rang out. A black shark shadow swept out from the muzzle of the cannon. The chain was pulled into a straight line in the air as it rushed out furiously. Dean only felt a slight buzzing in his ears. His oversensitive sense of smell suddenly smelled a pungent smell of gunpowder, which made him frown slightly. His eyes were fixed on the black giant shadow that was moving quickly on the giant wall. His heart was tightly raised. The speed of the tungsten steel shark spear was very fast. In just 2 seconds it had covered a distance of more than 500 meters. If it was shot horizontally on the ground, then the speed would sharply decrease after the initial range. But at this moment, the shark spear was flying faster and faster with the help of its weight and the steam nozzle. It was almost close to the speed of sound. It must be known that the speed of an ordinary pistol bullet was around 400 meters per second. But at this moment, Dean was able to make a giant weapon like the shark spear to reach a speed close to the speed of sound. Moreover, the destructive power of the shark spear was far more than 100 times better than a normal bullet. Roar! When the shark spear flew halfway to the giant wall, Splitter on the ground seemed to have sensed it. It roared angrily and struggled to get up. However, the momentum of the shark spear and its own weight had caused it to be seriously injured. 2 or 3 of its sickle arms were bent, sputtering out green liquid. The tail end of the thin wings on its back was folded like a transparent metal plate, which couldn't be kept inside the carapace that protected its wings. Just when it got up, the shark spear flew over its head. Puff! The sharp shark spear instantly pierced through the edge of the Splitter's body. The Splitter quickly retreated. But it was still hit. It roared in pain like the roar of a tiger or a dragon. Dean didn't look at the result as he quickly picked up the third shark spear. At the same time, he ordered Nicholas to move the 4th shark spear. Dean immediately adjusted the muzzle after loading the 3rd shark lance into the barrel. He aimed at the splitter under the giant wall. He knew that he had hit the target the moment he heard its painful roar. He saw that the shark lance was nailed in front of the splitter's body. The tail of the shark lance was 6 or 7 meters high. The chain at the tail of the shark lance had fallen to the ground. The tail of the shark lance was automatically connected with the tail of the previous shark lance. It was tightly wrapped around the splitter's body. This naturally wasn't a coincidence but a suction force. In the past few days, Dean had been pondering over the whole plan to hunt Splitter. He had been deliberating step by step. He had played all the details to the extreme. The chain was one of them. He had added a section of magnet chain on top of the tungsten steel chain. At this moment, the two magnets were attracted to each other and twisted around the Splitter's body. Originally, with the size of Splitter, it would be very difficult for the magnetic strength of the two chains at the tail end of the shark's spear to gather together. So Dean's assumption was that after hitting 6 or 7 chains, the probability of the magnets attracting each other would be much higher. But he didn't expect that the second chain of the shark's spear would entangle each other. God is helping me. You won't be able to escape today. Dean's eyes were full of fighting spirit. He adjusted the muzzle and ignited the third shark spear. Boom! The muzzle spat out flames as the shark spear shot out. Dean's ears were somewhat deafened. His hearing was blurred. He felt that the handle of the gun was boiling hot. Although the barrel had been smelted and was more heat-resistant, but he didn't expect that the third shark spear would be scalding hot. He estimated that he could only fire 4 times in a row. Otherwise, the barrel would explode and he would be hurt. On the ground, Splitter angrily roared. It brandished its scythe and chopped at the tungsten steel chain. Only a ding-ding sound could be heard. The tungsten steel chain was actually dented by the scythe's sharp blade. If the scythe's strength was a little stronger, it could have directly broken the tungsten steel chain. In reality, if it was a tungsten steel plate of the same thickness, the splitter would definitely be able to cut through it. However, the chain was a flexible weapon. When it received an attack, it would disperse the force to all parts of the body. In addition, the two magnets had pulled the chain quite a bit when it received an attack. That was why the chain was not cut in half. Splitter let out a few low growls. It seemed to be a little irritated. It crawled up from the ground. This time, it seemed to have noticed the attack above its head. When Shark Lance flew to a height of 700 meters, its body had already rolled to the side. It crawled to the other side, and ran towards the wilderness ruins in the distance. Bang! The third shark spear struck the ground and penetrated the soil, completely submerging into it. The chain at the end of the spear was dragged more than 10 meters into the ground, which showed how powerful its momentum was. Dean slightly frowned as he took the fourth shark lance. He touched the steam nozzle on the back of the lance and quickly loaded it. He aimed at the direction where the splitter was running. In a short period of 0.5 seconds, he forcibly predicted the splitter's position and ignited the ignition. Both of his hands held the hot barrel handle as he adjusted the angle and aimed at the splitter in a diagonal line. As a hunter, he was able to lock the target quickly. Boom! The shark lance suddenly popped out, and a hot wave of heat came from the barrel. Dean's right hand shrank as he tightly held the handle. He hurriedly loosened his left hand and didn't continue to load the shark lance. His eyes were fixed on the shark lance that was shot out. The black shark spear moved in a straight diagonal line. The steam nozzle was turned on by the momentum. It spat out white waves. It looked like a black shark was moving rapidly in the sea. Splitter's running speed was not very fast. The two shark spears had left deep wounds on its body, and the pain was unbearable as it ran. At the same time, the chains on the shark spears had wrapped around some of its scythe-like arms. It was as if a person's hands had been tied up. Splitter's sense of balance was greatly affected, and it was difficult for him to run at full speed. The splitter was hiding in the depths of the grass. It suddenly sensed something and looked back. It saw the shark spear approaching at high speed. It was startled and hastily bounced sideways to avoid the shark spear's trajectory. After the previous attacks, its intelligence had determined that Splitter could only attack in a straight line. However, it had miscalculated this time. Just as it tried its best to jump to the side, the shark spear suddenly made a slight turn and chased after it. Splitter was so frightened that it started to flee in panic. However, the more it ran, the closer the shark spear got. If it had stopped on the spot, it would have been able to dodge the shark spear's attack and let the shark spear hit the ground in front of it. However, most land creatures had little experience in defending against attacks from the sky. Even Splitter was no exception. As a result, the faster it ran, the closer the shark spear got. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. It was too fast for people to think and judge. Chapter 330. Dean was overjoyed as he saw this scene. He couldn't wait to load another shark spear to chase after the Splitter. But he calmly restrained himself. If he continued to fire, the barrel was likely to burst. Nicholas, who was next to the battery, looked at the Splitter thousands of meters away from the giant wall. His eyes were full of shock. He didn't expect that such a terrifying giant monster would be so embarrassed in front of this boy. Although he didn't know much about monsters, but he knew that such a giant monster's hunting level was absolutely extraordinary. Otherwise, people like Dean, who was close to a senior hunter's physique, wouldn't be so cumbersome to prepare a lot of items and carefully rely on such a natural terrain advantage to attack. What shocked him even more was that Dean had assembled such a terrifying weapon. Coupled with the tungsten steel spear, its destructive power was simply terrifying. He couldn't help but think that if such a weapon was installed on every fortress inside the giant wall, then how could the barbarians dare to invade? However, in addition to the weapon, what made him feel the most was Dean himself. He had never seen such a terrible person, not to mention that the latter was just a young boy. Previously, he clearly saw that when Dean was loading the shark spear, he deliberately adjusted the angle of the metal cylinder on the shark spear. At that time, he had some doubts, but when he saw the shark spear being shot, he realized that it was Dean's masterpiece. Insidious prediction and calculation. In just a few seconds, his perception of Dean had once again undergone earth-shaking changes. Before, he thought that Dean was a mature and talented architect. For this age, he was a rare character. But at this moment, no matter how he looked at Dean, he felt that the latter was like a devil in human clothes. This terrible calculation and coldness, as well as the extraordinary wisdom to forge terrible weapons, were by no means possessed by human beings. In the pair of calm eyes, there seemed to be a deep evil aura, overlooking everything. He couldn't help but feel regret in his heart. He shouldn't have exposed his ambition too early and offended such a monster. At this moment, looking at the ferocious giant beast that was 1,000 meters away and struggling with its whole body wrapped in chains, his heart felt cold and his limbs went cold. He stared blankly and was speechless. "Give me the bow." Dean's voice brought Nicotine back to reality. Nicotine's hair stood up as he heard Dudien's words. He instinctively reacted quickly as he looked around and found the bow and arrows that Dudien had brought. He went forward and picked them up. Dudien wanted the bow. Was he going to? He turned and trotted quickly, handing the bow and arrows to Dean. Dean grabbed the bow and arrow but didn't look at him. His eyes were firmly locked on the Splitter. He saw the Splitter desperately struggle and finally cut off one of the chains. Its body regained some mobility and quickly ran away. However, its speed wasn't as fast as it came. Dean's eyes narrowed slightly. Holding the bow, he took a step forward and stood on the edge of the giant wall. Facing the cold wind, his clothes fluttered in the wind. Nicholas was scared as he saw Dean's bold move. The wind at the height of a kilometer was extremely fierce. A little bit of carelessness and he would be swept down. Even a person with a high physique would find it difficult to resist. Dean wasn't nervous. Instead, he slowly opened his arms and held the bow in one hand as if to embrace the wind. He was indeed embracing the wind. His body slowly leaned forward, and then he suddenly leaped. Whoosh! Dean's body quickly fell down. Nicotine's heart almost jumped out of his throat. He couldn't help but scream. He didn't think that Dean would commit suicide. He rushed to the edge and stretched his head to look down. He saw that Dean's body had shifted to the front. The bow in his hand was relatively heavy. His jumping posture quickly changed to head down and feet up. Nicotine's mind went blank. A moment ago he was afraid of Dean, but now he was committing suicide in such a way? He couldn't figure it out, but it was the truth. Dean, who was falling about 100 meters down, suddenly had a semicircular cloth appear under his armpits. His falling speed was greatly reduced, and he was gliding forward. If people from the old era saw this scene, they would be extremely familiar with it. This was the gliding equipment of extreme sport. But at the moment, Dean was using it to hunt monsters. Nicotine's eyes almost popped out of their sockets as he stared at the scene in front of him. A person was flying? Whoosh! Dean opened his arms. He was a little nervous. This was his first flight test. It was the first time he used it in actual combat. Moreover, he was facing a legendary monster that had reached level 68. He admired his courage. At this moment, his ears were filled with the whistling of the wind. His arms swayed slightly, adjusting the angle of his glide. After gliding for 200 to 300 meters, he grasped a bit of the wind and was able to control the angle of his glide a bit more. Looking at the wilderness and the great earth below him, all of the blood in his body sped up. This intense stimulation caused his hormones to soar and his blood to boil. After gliding to 500 meters above the ground, he tried to adjust the angle to follow behind the splitter. Although the gliding speed was extremely fast, the splitter's running speed was even faster. Previously, when he was on the giant wall, he didn't have a strong feeling. But the closer he got, the more he felt the amazing speed of the splitter. Moreover, it was injured. Boom! Boom! The splitter quickly ran forward. Along the way, the weeds were cut by the giant sword. The distance between the splitter and Dean was quickly pulled apart. In the blink of an eye, the splitter had run to a place where Dean needed to look up to see it. By the time it reached a height of more than 200 meters, the splitter had run away and was about to disappear at the end of his line of sight. Dean didn't continue to look at the splitter. He touched the small backpack on his back. He had worn this backpack when he was climbing. At this moment, the backpack was pulled open, and a fluffy cloth suddenly flew out. It was a parachute. This was the backpack that Dean had prepared for himself when he was climbing. In case he accidentally fell, it could save his life. After the parachute opened, Dean slowly descended to the ground. After landing, he rolled over and quickly untied the backpack. He held the bow in one hand and the quiver in the other. He quickly chased after the splitter. The real hunt had now begun. He bought 100 pounds of each type of poison every day. In a few days, he bought more than 1,000 pounds of poison. If it weren't for the fact that the antidotes for these poisons had already been developed and that they weren't instant poisons, the sale of these poisons would have been banned in the temple long ago. Dean specially forged 6 shark spears that were loaded with poison. The tip of each shark spear was filled with mercury. Behind the mercury was a thin layer of metal. The body of the shark spear was filled with poison. The reason behind the shark spear was the same as his mercury arrows. They were made using the explosive method of the old era. When the shark spear pierced into Splitter's body, the highly dense mercury inside the spear's tip would instantly break through the spear's tip and pour into Splitter's body. Once the mercury broke through the hole, the poison inside the spear would also flow out and seep into Splitter's body. If the poison directly poured into some important body parts, it would have an unexpected effect. After all, these poisons were all top-notch poisons that he had never banned from selling. Some were in the form of powder, and some were in the form of liquid. No matter what kind of poison it was, A sesame-sized one would be able to poison an ordinary adult strong man. If the poison wasn't treated for a long time, it would certainly be fatal. If it was directly injected into the blood vessels, then, even if it was a slow poison, it would instantly take a person's life. However, at the moment the splitter was attacked by 3 shark spears. The shark spears had pierced into its body, but it still had some strength left. The tenacity of its vitality was really terrifying. Is it because the mercury didn't penetrate the spear tip and the venom didn't pour into its body? Dean couldn't help but doubt. He silently calculated the time when the 3 poisons would take effect. He wanted to use these poisons to exhaust the splitter to death. If he couldn't exhaust the splitter to death, then he would have to run away. As for hunting, unless the splitter was on the verge of death and couldn't move. Otherwise he would never take the risk of using his arrows to tickle the splitter's carapace. The main purpose of bringing the bow and arrows was to guard against other monsters. Dean was a little glad that Splitter's body structure showed that it belonged to the extreme attack type monster. All of its limbs were sharp blades, which caused its defense to be far inferior to other monsters of the same level. If it was like the guardian of the 8 legendary monsters, then he would have to give up. It was estimated that even if he made a tank or cannon, it would be difficult to hurt that monster. Time ticked by. The splitter was lying on the ground to rest. It seemed that it was unwilling to move. Dean looked at it from afar. He wasn't sure if it was tired and resting or if it was exhausted by the venom. After waiting for a long time, he couldn't help but want to pull the bow and shoot to see its reaction. But in the end he held back. If the splitter was just resting, then his action would undoubtedly be courting death. He could only continue to wait and observe. This was a problem that most hunters would encounter during hunting, and he had to solve it. The time for the 3 poisons to take effect in the human body is 4 hours, 10 hours and 18 hours respectively. Dean's eyes flashed slightly. Its physique is completely different from that of a human. Humans' poison time is completely useless. Father said that if we use mismatched data as a reference, the result will inevitably be a failure. I have to test it, but I can't use the bow and arrows. He thought for a moment and suddenly remembered that there was still a small cluster of Splitter's blood powder in his armor. His eyes suddenly lit up. He turned around and returned to the residential building. In the absence of electricity, the building was dark even in broad daylight. The windows were covered by thick vines and dust. Dean's eyes quickly swept over and quickly followed the smell. He found several active blood-sucking rats in a hole in the corner. Whoosh! He quickly jumped over and grabbed a blood-sucking rat. He pinched its neck so that it couldn't bite his wrist. After the blood-sucking rat was caught, its companions were scared and immediately shrank back into the hole. They ran straight to the next floor. Dean didn't pay attention to the other blood-sucking rats. He grabbed the squeaky rat and went back to the roof. He took out the rest of the blood powder and tied it to the neck of the rat. The blood powder was wrapped around the back of the rat's neck to prevent it from being torn off by its claws. The rat squeaked anxiously. It seemed that it was afraid of the smell of the undead on Dean's body. Dean pinched its body and threw it to the splitter in front of him. At the moment he was 2 or 3 kilometers away from the splitter. The rat was thrown about 700 or 800 meters away and fell into the grass. Chapter 332. Squeak. The blood-devouring rat fell into the grass, which was denser than its surroundings. The blood-devouring rat rolled 7 or 8 times after falling into the grass, but it did not die on the spot. It grimaced in pain as it screamed and rolled its body, trying to get up. However, one of its legs was broken, and it could not stand firm even after trying several times. In the end, it could only crawl on the ground and slowly drag its body towards a patch of grass to the side. Dean shrank his body to the edge of the bungalow. He only revealed a pair of eyes as he stared at Splitter. He didn't care whether the rat was dead or alive. Whether it was dead or alive, Splitter wouldn't care about the ability of this little thing. The real test for Splitter was the blood powder on the back of the rat. There was only the sound of the breeze. Dean held his breath as time passed. In the blink of an eye, 7 or 8 seconds had passed. Splitter heard the sound of the rat falling into the bungalow. There was no movement after that. Dean's heartbeat gradually accelerated. He didn't see any movement from Splitter after 10 seconds. His heart was relieved. His eyes flashed with killing intent. He quickly opened the quiver on his back and pulled out an arrow. He jumped down the bungalow and jumped into the desolate street. Thick weeds grew in the cracks of the street to cover his body. I have to hit its flaws. Dean was approaching at full speed. This was the most dangerous moment. He would personally give the monster a final fatal blow. Moreover, he only had one chance to make a move. Dean was also observing Splitter when he secretly delivered food to the small Splitter. After all, it was a legendary monster. Whether it was the Temple of Elements or the forces of the Inner Wall, it was a precious opportunity to observe a legendary monster at such a close distance. Dean roughly understood the structure of Splitter's body and observed its 2 weaknesses. The first one was the eyeball. For most creatures, the eyeball was the weakest part. This was no exception for Splitter. However, the eyelid on the outside of its eyeball was a sturdy protective layer. It was one of the rare creatures that had evolved their eyelids into armor. Moreover, the thickness of the armor was 3 centimeters. Even an ordinary handgun bullet would only be able to leave a dent on the surface of the armor. Therefore, the only way to hit the eyeball was to grab the moment before the eyelid closed. The second weakness was its excretion. Out of all the limbs on its body, more than 80% were scythe-like arms, and the remaining 20% were the head and the torso. This was an extremely shocking ratio. Its torso was flat, and its surface was covered by a layer of hard carapace. The edges were extremely sharp, and if it were a human's body, even the waist would be as sharp as a blade, and could be used to attack enemies. Dean was not surprised to see the subway stop at the platform. He immediately ran towards it. Before he attacked Splitter, he had perceived the surrounding environment. The smell of decay was very strong. It was obvious that there was a subway stop at the platform. Otherwise there wouldn't be such a strong smell of decay. Bang! Dean went into the subway through the window. The subway was dark. There were 2 rows of seats with corpses lying on the ground. Most of them were bones covered with thick dust. The flesh and blood had long decayed over the years. There were also some dried corpses lying on the ground. Their skin was wrinkled. They looked like 80-years-old people. There were patches of brown spots on their skin. Their cheeks and clothes looked like those of young people in their 20s. Dean's eyes turned cold as he saw the corpses. He didn't go near them. He ignored them and ran straight to the subway. The corpses suddenly opened their eyes and reached out to grab Dean as Dean passed by. But Dean's speed was too fast, so they caught nothing. The next moment, all the corpses stood up one by one like evil spirits. Their wrinkled faces were incomparably ferocious as they growled and chased after Dean. Dean saw that these guys were alarmed. He sighed in his heart. Although he had smeared the undead powder, but he was too nervous when he was attacking Splitter. His sweat had caused his smell to overshadow the smell of the undead powder. So he couldn't fool them. The Monster Atlas says that the undead are afraid of fire and will follow the light. When it is dark, they will follow the sound. When it is silent, the undead will sleep. Dean ran all the way and found that there were 7 or 8 undead sleeping in each subway carriage. Due to the lack of light and food for a long time, their skin was shriveled and they were seriously dehydrated. With the appearance of Dean, all the undeads sleeping in the subway woke up and roared as they chased after Dean. Dean took out the undead powder and continued to smear it on his body. Rumble! Outside the subway, a loud noise could be heard. It was Splitter. Its huge body squeezed into the subway through the gap. Bang! Dean felt the subway under his feet slightly vibrate. He could not help but be aghast. He could only hear a harsh creaking sound coming from behind. It was like nails scratching a metal plate. It was a sharp friction sound. Dean couldn't help but think that Splitter wouldn't cut off the subway, right? With the sharpness of the latter's scythe arm, it wouldn't be difficult to cut off the subway. Dean didn't dare to stop and continued to run. Some of the revived undead roared and rushed towards Splitter after smelling the smell of Splitter. Some were still chasing behind Dean. These undead were fearless. Soon more than a dozen undead gathered in front of Splitter. They bared their fangs and brandished their claws at the behemoth. I advise you not to get close and leave as soon as possible. It is very dangerous here. The girl in the tang suit heard Dean's words, but she seemed to be relieved and said to herself, "It seems that I have found the right place." She looked up and grabbed Dean's shoulder. "Tell me, where is it? Or where did you see its footprints?" Dean showed a sincere look. "You should go back. Even if you find it, it is moving around and has no fixed residence. Maybe tomorrow it will go out into the wilderness." "I don't like to ask twice. Are you going to tell me or not?" The girl's face turned cold as a trace of coldness flashed in her eyes. Dean saw her expression, and suddenly felt a sense of danger. His whole body was slightly cold. He was shocked in his heart. This girl's strength was a lot higher than his own. She was even stronger than Glenn. She should be at the top of the senior hunter level. She was able to defeat the level 24 snow-toothed boar from far away to prove this point. "All right, I will take you there." Dean immediately gave in. There was no law and order outside the giant wall. If he was killed, he would be killed. There was no way to pursue it. If his skill was not as good as others, he could only admit defeat. "Humph!" The girl snorted and pushed away Dean's body. "Hurry up. If it runs away, you will be ready to sacrifice to my blood vessel." Dean smiled slightly. Although he didn't know what the blood vessel was, he could understand the word sacrifice. He immediately turned around and went back to the original road. He didn't dare to play tricks before he could figure out the magic mark of the girl in the tang suit. He didn't want to anger her and lose his life. It didn't take long for Dean and the girl to return to the subway station. The ground was full of huge footprints and traces of crushed limbs left by the Splitter. The girl's face slightly changed as she saw the traces of destruction caused by the Splitter. She slowly raised her hand and grabbed the huge hilt on her back. The length of the hilt was about 50 centimeters. Under the hilt was a huge sword that was as wide as a door. The whole body was blood-red. The edge of the huge sword had a diagonal groove like a shark fin. Such a structural design would completely destroy the flesh and blood of the monster. The entire blood-red sword was nearly 3 meters tall, and the width of the blade was almost the same as the width of the girl's delicate body. From the back, it looked like a blood-red sword was walking on its own. Dean was careful to get information from the girl as he led the way. The girl's character seemed to be more casual. She answered most of the questions casually. Dean knew that the blood vessel she had mentioned before was this blood-red sword. "All right, I have found its footprints. You can get out of here." The girl was elegant and noble, but there was not the slightest bit of politeness in her words. Dean was speechless. There was a trace of gloominess on his face. "It should not be far from here. You'd better leave here immediately." Long-winded, the girl quickly followed the direction of the footprints without looking back. Her hand was on the hilt of the sword. It seemed that she was ready to deal with any attack from the surroundings. Dean looked at the girl's posture. It seemed that she was going to hunt the Splitter. He was startled. His eyelids twitched as he quickly followed the girl. The girl in the tang suit seemed to have heard some movements and rushed straight to the subway entrance where the road had collapsed. She stopped abruptly in front of the gap like a javelin. Such an abrupt braking surprised Dean, who was chasing after her. Previously, he saw that the girl was running faster than him at full speed. How could she stop just like that? It could only mean that the girl's previous speed was very slow for her. It was like a trot for an ordinary person. Only in this way could she stop at the same time. The girl looked down from the gap. There was a touch of smile on her face. "Finally found you." While talking, he heard the sound coming from behind. He glanced at Dean, who was chasing behind him, and the smile in his eyes suddenly turned cold. Reckless. She retracted her gaze and ignored Dean. She was not in the mood to care about the safety of others in front of the enemy. Whoosh! She held the hilt of the sword and jumped down. After landing on the ground, she suddenly saw a huge figure crawling on the ground in front of her. There were some corpses gathering around the figure and crawling towards Splitter. Some corpses that had been cut into two pieces were still crawling towards Splitter, and then they were cut into two halves again. The girl was startled when she saw the appearance of the Splitter. There was a trace of doubt in her eyes. She looked at the body of the Splitter. She saw that there were black chains wrapped around the body of the Splitter. The chains were obviously artificially made. There was a giant spear-like weapon piercing its body. Seeing this scene, her eyes were filled with shock. Could it be that someone else had hunted this evil beast before? Roar! Splitter seemed to have sensed a trace of danger. Its body, which was lying on the ground, moved slightly, and moved its body with difficulty. It overturned and crushed the nearby subway car, and looked down at the girl in the tang suit in front of it. From this small figure, it felt a trace of fear, so it let out a threatening roar, which was vigorous and deep, full of anger. The girl calmed herself down and took a deep breath. She stared at Splitter with her pitch-black eyes and dashed towards him. Dean, who was crawling in the hole, secretly watched the girl's action. At the moment he saw her directly rush towards the Splitter. He couldn't help but be shocked. Is she crazy? She knew that the Splitter was a level 68 monster. How could she dare to attack it head-on? Chapter 334. Whoosh! The girl in the tang suit jumped up. The bandage slowly fell off. The gray and dirty bandage wrapped around the Blood Baron's sword on her back suddenly disintegrated. The dark red sword released a demonic luster like a bloodthirsty beast. It flashed with a red light of excitement. The girl in the tang suit wielded the sword like a blood-red crescent moon. She fiercely chopped the Splitter's body. Splitter screamed and waved its other two scythe-like arms. The width of these two scythe-like arms was more than double that of the other scythe-like arms. Although they looked like attacking limbs, they were used for defense. They were like two huge doors that blocked the front part of its body. The two scythe-like arms collided with the bloody sword in the hands of the girl in the tang suit. Boom! A huge pit suddenly appeared on the ground. Splitter's huge body sank into the huge pit. The place where Blood Baron collided with the black scythe arm created a strong airflow, sweeping away the rancid smell in the air. However, it also swept up the dust on the ground. Dean, who was lying on the ground, was shocked. He saw that the girl in the tang suit had used her toes to borrow the strength of the scythe-like arms. She flipped back and retreated. But when she flipped 180 degrees, she stepped on the inside of the other scythe-like arms. Once again, she used the strength of the scythe-like arms to attack Splitter at full speed. Bang! Splitter's body shook. The scythe-like arms that had been cut by the bloody sword burst open. Blood and green fluid sputtered out. The girl in the tang suit pulled her wrist. The bloody sword cut through the wound like a saw-tooth. Blood quickly sputtered out. Splitter issued a sharp roar. It waved its scythe-like arms to flank the other scythe-like arms. However, the girl's movements were incomparably fast. After the first strike landed, she quickly stepped on Splitter's scythe-like arm and circled around to the other side of its body. With a swing of her arm, the Blood Baron's greatsword was like a blood-colored whirlwind blade as it fiercely chopped at another part of Splitter's body. This time, it directly chopped at a joint, instantly chopping off one of Splitter's scythe-like arms that were swinging back to attack. All of this happened in a flash. The girl in the tang suit was so fast that she was like a purple afterimage. She moved quickly on the body of Splitter. She used the tungsten steel chain that was wrapped around Splitter's body as a foothold. She constantly waved the bloody sword and cut off the scythe-like arms. Dean was dumbfounded. Is this the power of a human? Boom! The girl in the tang suit went to the back of Splitter. Dean couldn't see where she was. Splitter's body trembled and issued a painful scream. The next moment, the scythe-like arms softened. A large amount of blood and green mucus was spat out from the middle of its body. Whoosh! The girl in the tang suit flipped back and landed more than 10 meters away from Splitter. She was holding the bloody sword in her hand. The bloody sword looked like a beast that had drunk its fill of blood. The battle was over in just 10 seconds or so. Splitter was defeated. Dean looked at the girl who was more than 10 meters away from the Splitter. Her chest was heaving up and down violently. He had forgotten to hide his emotions. He was shocked and couldn't speak for a long time. He had expected all kinds of result. He even guessed that the girl in the tang suit had extraordinary strength. But he never thought that the strength she possessed would be so terrifying. It was simply beyond the scope of human. Could it be that this was the level that humans could evolve to? Is this the existence of a senior hunter? The girl in the tang suit gasped for a moment. She gradually recovered some of her physical strength. Although the battle was short, but the consumption was huge. She looked at the dying Splitter. She held the bloody sword and once again rushed forward. Bang! Bang! Splitter was unable to resist and was immediately beheaded by her sword. A legendary monster that was rarely seen in 100 years had died. Dean witnessed the whole process. He never thought that the girl with snow-white skin and a beautiful and delicate appearance would have such strength like a monster. His heart was pounding. The first thing that came to his mind was that he would be killed. He secretly regretted it. If he knew that this would happen, he wouldn't have continued to follow. It was obviously too late to escape. With the speed of the girl in the tang suit, she could easily catch up with him. His face was ugly. At this moment, not to mention getting the magic mark of Splitter, he might even lose his small life. The girl in the tang suit inserted the bloody sword into one of the wounds on Splitter's body. She put her hands on the hilt of the bloody sword and gasped for breath. If it wasn't for the fact that she was wearing a tang suit, she would have directly sat on the big guy and rested. After resting for a while, she lifted up the Chong Sam's skirt by her thighs, revealing a wilderness waist bag tied to her snow-white and slender legs. She opened the waist bag and took out a small red bottle. She uncorked the bottle and sprinkled some red powder on the wound pierced by the Blood Baron's greatsword. After pouring the red powder, the girl in the tang suit took out a metal cylinder that was as thick as a wrist. It occupied more than half of the interior area of the bag. She opened the metal cylinder and quietly waited. Soon, a black object slowly wriggled up the blade of the Blood Baron greatsword. It was a jet-black insect as thick as a finger. Dean's eyes turned red. There was no doubt that this was the Splitter's parasitic soul worm that he had spent a lot of effort to get. Compared with the parasitic soul worms he had seen before, this one was more than 10 times thicker. Ordinary parasitic soul worms were as thin as blood vessels, but this one was like an adult leech, fat and big. The girl in the tang suit stretched out 2 fingers and pinched the bloody sword with lightning speed. She threw it into the metal cylinder, closed the lid and tightened it. She put it into the waist bag and pulled out the bloody sword. She turned her head and glanced at Dean, who was above the gap, and hooked her finger at him. Dean's eyes quickly moved away from her waist bag. He stared at her expression for a moment. Seeing that she didn't seem to have any killing intent, he was a little relieved. He carefully jumped down from the gap and said, "I have a way to make you believe that I won't say anything." The girl in the tang suit saw Dean's trembling and cautious appearance. She giggled and ridiculed him. "Really? But I only know that the dead won't say anything." Dean saw her expression and faintly guessed that she was just deliberately intimidating him. But he still couldn't help but feel nervous. This was the sorrow of the weak. He hated himself for being weak. At the same time, his mind quickly turned to various escape methods. In addition to the dead, there are many ways to shut people up. The girl in the tang suit gently smiled. I didn't expect that a person who is so afraid of death like you would dare to attack the splitter. It's really impressive." Her eyes looked at Dean as she spoke. Dean's heart shivered. He knew that she had noticed the tungsten steel chain on the splitter's body. How would I dare to attack it? If I knew that there was such a big guy here, then I wouldn't have come out to hunt. The injuries on its body should be caused by someone as strong as you. I'm just an intermediate hunter. I don't have such ability. The girl in the tang suit said, "There are a few undeads on the ground. It's obvious that they were killed by someone. Your shoes are stained with blood. Is it a coincidence? Besides, as far as I know, anyone who can come here to kill the splitter would never use such a method to attack it. You don't need to deny it. You are just an intermediate hunter, but you dare to come here to hunt this evil beast. I admire you." Dean's face changed when he heard her words. He didn't bother to criticize her and said in an old-fashioned tone, "I admit that the injury on its body was caused by me. I just borrowed the power of some tools, so I was lucky enough to hurt it." The girl in the tang suit narrowed her eyes as she looked at Dean from head to toe. After a moment there was a smile on her face. "Well, it's rare to meet an interesting little guy. What is your name?" Dean was speechless as he heard her call him little guy. He believed that the girl in the tang suit was not an old witch but a genuine little girl. Of course, it may be related to her own strength. Her strength caused her to look down on her peers. He thought for a moment and truthfully said, "My name is Dean. What about you?" The girl in the tang suit was interested. "You dare to ask my name? It's impolite not to reciprocate," Dean said. "You know my name and I know yours. It's fair." The girl in the tang suit said, "It's fair, but aren't you afraid that I'll kill you?" "I'm afraid." Dean looked at her. "But if you want to kill me, it won't be because I asked your name. At the same time, it will instinctively absorb the energy from your body. In other words, the parasitic soul worm is used to absorbing the energy from Splitter's body. With your physique, it will be impossible for you to provide so much energy. In the end, the parasitic soul worm will be devoured by the magic marks and die." Dean was stunned. The girl said, "You hunters don't know about this because no one is able to kill a monster that is several times stronger than their physical strength. You are an intermediate hunter and yet you dare to kill an adult legendary monster. You are the first person in history to do so. But some big forces have already verified that the human body can only absorb parasitic soul worms within 20 hunting rank. In other words, a commoner can only absorb the magic marks of a monster within 20 hunting rank. If the parasitic soul worm is absorbed from a monster of 21 or 22 hunting ranks, then there will be a backlash from the magic marks. Even if it's a monster of 17, 18, or 19, it's still very risky. The slightest bit of carelessness can cause a backlash from the magic marks. To put it simply, the most extreme absorption is 20 hunting ranks, and the safest absorption is 10 hunting rank. If you absorb a parasitic soul worm that is 15 hunting ranks higher than you, the probability of the magic mark's backlash will gradually increase. Dean looked at her serious appearance. He knew that she should not be teasing him. His heart was afraid and regretful. Fortunately, he had a little splitter hidden inside the giant wall. In the future, it could provide him with magic marks. "You are talking about the inner wall's evaluation of the monsters. Do we humans also have a hunting level?" Dudian asked. The girl in the tang suit said, "Of course, but we humans don't have a clear division of hunting levels. We just use different positions to replace them. For example, a primary hunter has a corresponding hunting level from 1 to 8. If you reach the limit, then it is about 10. If you are an intermediate hunter, then your physical strength is close to the monster that is level 20. So, if you are an intermediate hunter, then you can only absorb the parasitic soul worm within level 40. Even if you kill the monster that is above level 40, you can't absorb it. You can only store it or resell it. There is no special method to store it. The girl in the tang suit looked at Dean. If it was an average person, I would be too lazy to talk about this. There is almost no one who can cross 20 hunting levels to kill a monster, including me. Dean wryly smiled. He thought that it was useless if he couldn't absorb the parasitic soul worm. In the future, if you are lucky and don't die outside the giant wall, then you can go to the Dragon Clan to find me. The girl calmly looked at Dean. If I die, then I didn't say anything. You better not show off this matter in the outer wall. Although he was glad that he couldn't absorb the magic marks of the splitter, but he couldn't help but regret that the prey fell into the hands of others. Or it should be said that it fell into the hands of the group of people who had real power inside the giant wall. Sitting inside the wall, even if it was the magic mark of a legendary monster, there would be people hunting it and sending it to him. Compared with such a character, he was still too small. He sighed and looked down at the splitter under his feet. Suddenly, his eyelids fiercely jumped and his heart beat wildly. Egg! There are eggs! Dean suddenly thought of the cave of the splitter. He felt that his whole body's blood was boiling, especially when he thought of the words of the girl in the tang suit. Even with his mental strength, he couldn't help but breathe fast. His eyes were red. He quickly turned around and ran along the stairs out of the subway. He didn't even care about the body of the splitter on the ground. His mind quickly constructed a map of the surroundings. According to the memory of the last time, he ran towards the cave of the splitter. Run, run, run. Dean's legs were flying. His ears were full of whistling wind. His heart was full of tension and strong excitement. Although the splitter was dead, but there were still eggs in its cave. Moreover, the last time Dean saw that there were a lot of eggs. So many eggs, if all of them hatched, he could even use the magic marks of the splitter to carry out deification. Legendary deification. As he thought of this, his heart was pounding. What level would the legendary magic marks be after deification? Unimaginable! Whoosh, whoosh. Dean was like a gust of wind as he rushed towards Splitter's cave. Whoosh! A giant shadow jumped out of the grass and attacked Dean. Dean, who was running, was startled. His body reflexively dodged the giant shadow. He looked back and saw that it was a chameleon. Its body was nearly 7 meters long. It had a crocodile-like mouth and sharp fangs. It was rushing towards him. Jungle chameleon! Dean's face slightly changed. This was a level 17 monster. He quickly jumped away. At the same time, he quickly pulled out an arrow and shot at the mouth of the lizard. Puff! You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.